College is often seen as one of the most thrilling phases in a person's academic journey, a time to gain independence, forge lifelong friendships, and perhaps even encounter a soulmate. Yet for one student, it would be their last chapter. Andrea DelVesco was full of excitement about starting her final year at UCLA. She never could have imagined her story would end so suddenly. But before we get into this, please let me just take one moment to introduce you to Andrea Lauren DelVesco. She was born in Chicago, Illinois, on June 29, 1994, to her parents Arthur and Leslie DelVesco. Andrea was the middle child. She had an older brother, James, who was 2 years older than her at the time, and her younger sister, Lexis, came along 4 years later in 1998. They became a family of 5, a happy family, a close family, a loving family. Everything a family should be, that's what the DelVescos were. Ultimately, they made their home out in Texas. Andrea's mother studied finance and marketing at Southern Methodist University. She worked at Merrill Lynch, had a job with American Airlines, and was a former account executive for residential mortgages at Citibank USA before becoming a stay-at-home mom. Arthur DelVesco, Andrea's father, owns DelVesco Family Investments, a holding and investment company. Andrea's family was well off. Her father was able to provide a very comfortable life and then some. But let's not let that cloud our vision on what's irreplaceable, no matter how much money someone has, and that's life. It's true that Andrea's father worked very hard and had a good income. I'm gauging this off a few things: the company he operates, the industry it's in, the pictures I've seen, and the home they owned. Mostly the last one, the home. The DelVescos lived in a subdivision called Glen Lake, which is part of Travis County in Austin. Look at the road into the DelVescos' neighborhood. Now, here's the front gate of their property. There were so many different websites with information about this house. Some said it had 11 bathrooms, so I have no idea how many bedrooms it would have had with 11 bathrooms. Other websites said it only had 9, and I've seen as low as 7. But one consistent fact is that it was around 10,000 square feet, and I'm pretty sure they had it built. I can't be sure how much they spent on it, but some sites were appraising it at $13 million, while others said $4 million. But really, I'm saying enough to say that it's a mansion to most of us. It's on almost 17 acres of land, and it has this winding driveway that leads up to the home. It even appears to have a lake on the property, as well as a swimming pool and possible guest homes. I can't be sure, but from what you can see from this bird's eye view, it's pretty big, with lots of land surrounding it. From what I've gathered during all of my research, this family was a good one. Arthur and Leslie were loving parents who instilled important values in their children. The DelVesco family was able to send their children to the best schools, which reinforced those values. They enrolled them at St. Andrew's Episcopal School, which is a K-2 school. The website says they empower scholars, artists, athletes, and servants since 1952. It's a private school with a dedicated faculty, a challenging academic program, fine and performing arts, competitive athletics, and a wide selection of extracurricular activities. Now, I mentioned it's an Episcopalian school, which focuses on chapel and religious tradition that's rooted in the Christian story of God's love and grace. No matter the person's, I guess you could call it, level of religious devotion. I know a variety of people send their children to Episcopalian schools for the quality of education. I've been told that they feel like it doesn't hurt that they're learning morals, even if they are religious-based. There were many of these schools where I'm from in Florida. Usually, they're popular among families that can afford to send their children there. All 3 of the DelVesco children were attending St. Andrew's, and they were thriving. During Andrea's high school career, she was a National Commended Merit Scholar. She won numerous awards for excelling in Latin, English, and Spanish. Andrea also excelled outside of the classroom, developing her leadership skills through her involvement in various extracurricular activities. She played field hockey and lacrosse for the varsity team at St. Andrews, and Leslie took note of Andrea's love for learning. She spent time reading, liked going to museums, enjoyed learning about art, but most of all, she was fascinated by people. She had a natural talent for being empathetic. She could feel others' feelings before they even told her how they felt. Since she was just in the first grade, she would never pass up the opportunity to volunteer, to lend a hand, and offer advice and support, even if it meant sacrificing her own time or resources. Her loyalty seemed to be unmatched. She was always there for those she cared about, no matter the cost. Her mom noticed that from a very young age, Andrea would know when her siblings were upset, and she was ready to comfort them. Leslie said that you could just see that she saw into your soul and understood exactly what you were going through. As I was learning all about Andrea, I got to know a lot about Leslie's nature and that of her other daughter, Alexis, Andrea's little sister. It became apparent to me that many of their qualities actually stemmed from what a caring, soft, and loving woman their mother was. She didn't just consider Andrea a daughter, she called her her best friend. They developed a very strong bond. Andrea once wrote her mother a letter that included these words: "Dear Mom, I love you with my whole heart, and I hope that I have inherited half of your strength. I will never love anyone as much as I love you." Her mom knew that Andrea was very special, that not many people had the capacity to love others the way that Andrea did. But it wasn't just her family that she extended her hands and her heart to. It was friends and also strangers. She enjoyed traveling, getting to know people, and learning about different cultures. For example, Andrea took a trip to Peru for her 16th birthday, when that's the day that you usually reserve for celebrating yourself. She spent that day helping villagers construct shelters by making bricks out of mud. This was a trip that she planned all on her own, and she spent 2 weeks camping in a tent, just exploring a different part of the world and the people who lived there. I could tell Andrea loved to have fun. I was looking at all her pictures of her growing up, like this one with her friends swinging off a rope into the water. They went rafting and boating, and she really looked like she enjoyed life. She had a great time with her friends, lots of laughing, and lots of pictures. Growing up, she was just adorable with this cute little smile and her shiny blonde hair. I could tell that she had a childhood full of activities, like horseback riding and vacations to the mountains. She created lots of memories with the people she loved the most. The way her dad was looking at her in this photo says everything without saying one word. Andrea made him proud. Her compassion set her apart more than anything, more than her straight A's or being on the honor society, even though those were accomplishments to be proud of. Andrew's parents were definitely proud of them. So was Alexis. She really looked up to her older sister. In Alexis's opinion, there was no one cooler than Andrea. She just said that there was something about her sister that drew you in, and Alexis admired Andrea's confidence, her grace, and her charisma. She felt like Andrea could do anything that she put her mind to, and she wanted to be just like her when she grew up. Whatever Andrea was doing, Alexis wasn't far behind. There were so many things to admire about Andrea. I read every single post on her Facebook and all the comments between her and her friends, and I got a clear picture of how witty she was. Andrea had a great sense of humor, and that, coupled with her adventurous spirit, enabled her to stand out. It was everything. It was the way that she dressed. Bright colors were her thing. Her funny outfits shocked and surprised her friends. She may have even acquired some of that uniqueness from attending St. Andrews, because it did focus on the performing arts. I could tell Andrea was the life of the party. You would know when she showed up because she would make sure of that. I'll tell you more about this because I think that as she grew more into her true self, she showed that, and that was when she was in college. But that was the next step in her life, something that she was looking forward to. After finishing her senior year in 2012, she had applied to a number of colleges, and Leslie was hoping that her daughter would choose the University of Chicago because her older brother, James, was studying there. Leslie felt like having 2 kids attending the same school would provide them with support and security. She knew that Andrea would be safe. But as each one of Andrea's acceptance letters came rolling in, Andrea wanted to wait until they all arrived before choosing which college she would attend. It's no surprise, with Andrea's love for adventure, that she wanted a challenge. She believed that you grow as a person when you push yourself outside of your comfort zone. One of the last acceptance letters to come in was from UCLA, and Andrea knew that it would be a huge change, going from a small town in Austin out to Los Angeles. She was more than ready. She was excited to tell her mom that she chose UCLA, and of course, Leslie was so happy for her. She remembers giving her a big hug and congratulating her on her acceptance. But what was so strange is when Leslie left and got back into her car, she broke down in tears. It was something she couldn't understand. Why was she so overcome with sadness? She found herself sobbing so hard, and she really couldn't pinpoint what it stemmed from. However, once you find out what happens, I think you'll believe what Leslie now thinks happened to her. It was like she had some kind of premonition in that moment. Leslie truly didn't feel right about Andrea leaving for Los Angeles, but of course, she wanted to support her daughter, and Andrea was looking forward to double majoring in psychology and Spanish. When she told her mom what she would be studying, especially when she said psychology, Leslie thought, wow, that's the perfect career path for Andrea, someone who always had a love for people and was very compassionate. She was a natural. Andrea was also interested in helping people abroad and moving to a Spanish-speaking country one day so she could experience another culture. It was part of her fascination with how people thought and what made them think the way that they did. It wasn't long before Andrea was moving into the dorms on the UCLA campus with the help of her family. It was her freshman year in the fall of 2012, right after she graduated that summer. She went from high school right into college, her first real experience away from home, away from the safety and security of the people she knew and the place she grew up. Leslie had to leave her daughter behind, and as they said goodbye, she looked at her and said, "Honey, this is your opportunity to grow and to be whatever you want to be. It must be so hard to let go like that. There's so much uncertainty," but that excited Andrea like it does with many people. Everything is new, and this is Los Angeles. It's a dream come true to live here. It's everything. It's the weather, the people, the adventure. There's so much to do in California, especially if you're like Andrea and you love people and new things. It's got everything. The snowy mountains for skiing, the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, the sandy beaches, the nightlife, the desert life. There's so much to do. It really is the perfect place for college, when most people are trying new things and trying to experience the world, especially coming here for college. In a place like UCLA, there's so much to do. You really get the real college experience at UCLA in particular. The school is beautiful, just look at the campus. Plus, it's a really great school academically, which is really important. UCLA is a highly regarded public research university. Many graduates from UCLA received prestigious awards, including Nobel Prizes, and UCLA ranked along with UC Berkeley as the 20th best college in the country in October 2022. Many people dream of attending UCLA. It attracts students from around the world, and that's partly because of its picturesque campus. Looking at this university, you might even think it belongs in a movie, especially if it's from the early 2000s. The scenery is stunning. It kind of reminds me of something like Clueless. And then of course there are the traditions. For one, the sorority life, and that was definitely something Andrea wanted to be a part of. It's also something you have to plan for because rush week starts right away during the first week of school. So knowing which sorority you want to be a part of is important, and Andrea had her sights set on one in particular, Pi Beta Phi. These are social clubs on campus, ones that are exclusive to those who are chosen to be part of them. So you essentially have to try out, you have to audition. This is a big goal for many girls. They want to be part of a sisterhood, they want to meet friends for life, and instantly have people to bond with, sort of like a built-in support system. The same goes for fraternities when it comes to guys in college. They want to be part of the coolest ones that throw the biggest and best parties, and of course, most of it is to impress the ladies. And, well, of course there is more to these groups than just partying. They do charity work, and they take part in many community-building activities. But for most college campuses, being a part of a fraternity or a sorority has its stigma. Pi Beta Phi helps young women achieve their full potential by fostering meaningful relationships with one another, and these relationships allow them to adapt to college by giving them a sense of belonging, support, and guidance. Their mission statement says, "We, The women of Pi Beta Phi are dedicated to creating an inclusive space for all our women. We acknowledge our history, and we will continue to reflect and educate ourselves, listen to the experiences of those within marginalized groups, and support our community. The UCLA campus is located in an area called Westwood, and students say that it's one of the most perfect places for a college town. It feels small, even though you're part of LA. It's very inclusive, with many students living there for school, so there are students everywhere, working in local restaurants and bars. It feels like you're always in good company. Of course, the streets are lined with the infamous fraternity houses and Greek Row, where there are whole neighborhoods that have big block parties. Many students don't even lock their doors because they come in and out of each other's apartments to hang out. Everyone is very welcoming, and it's all within walking distance of UCLA's campus. Places like Westwood Village have shopping and dining. It's an entertainment complex with restaurants, theaters, and much more. It's not only that there's so much to do in Westwood, but it's also a safe area where college students feel comfortable walking home at night by themselves. Andrea, who was known by everyone as Andy, was ready to experience all of this and more. She could not wait for Rush Week. It's the first week of college, and sororities also have what is known as Bid Day. This signifies the end of recruitment, or rush, and it's when all the invitations to join the sororities are sent out, and the women extend a bid. They attend a party hosted by the sorority that they're accepted into, and they meet everyone. It's a fun night, where you get to meet and get to know all the girls that you're going to be spending the rest of your college years with. All the upperclassmen welcome their new members into the sisterhood. It's full of fun, and it's a lot of excitement. This was the day Andrea met some of the women who would become her best friends, including two, Jessica and Jackie. Andrea was the type of person who was very easy to get along with, so many people actually called her their best friend. Andrea had a unique combination of a great personality, good sense of humor, and enthusiasm. It made her presence unforgettable. It left everyone around her feeling uplifted and happy. She and Jessica clicked right away. It was like they had an instant connection. That's the way Jessica put it. It was Andrea's crazy sense of style that really made her stand out, and that was something Andrea would become very well known for. Her unique fashion sense, because it was a great conversation starter, and of course her positive energy. She always lightened the mood when she was around, and she brought everyone together. She was a valuable asset to her new sorority, since that's what it's all about, bringing everyone together. Andrea also clicked with Jackie right from the start. Jackie loved Andrea's sense of humor. She called her outrageous and over the top. Andrea made friends with everyone. That's the type of person she was. She was many people's first friend at UCLA. She made sure to give them attention, even at orientation, and those friendships stood the test of time, which was most likely due to the fact that Andrea was described as having a big heart and that her kindness was contagious. She was known as being one of the sweetest people, even to strangers. But maybe that can also be a flaw, being too nice, too open, too friendly, when not everyone out there is one of the good ones. But it was clear that Andrea was. She was one of the good ones. I told you that she really grew into herself and the person that she was meant to be when she was in college. More of her personality began to shine through. She developed things like a signature outfit, which was a giant fur coat, and she would end up spending Christmas morning 1 year riding bikes around the Google offices in Mountain View, California, with a friend wearing her big white coat. He snapped this picture of her. But it didn't stop there. I told you that she had these outlandish outfits. That's what she was known for. Sarah Muir, another close friend and sorority sister, remembers meeting Andrea one night at a theme party. Most of the girls were dressed in really skimpy outfits, but Andrea walked in with this huge outfit that looks like a dress that you would wear as a Vegas showgirl, like a corset, even with little tassels. It was like she was jumping out of a cake, and the skirt was shaped like the cake. With this picture, I can see why Andrea's friends called her unique and fun. I can't help but hear the song, "Happy Birthday, Mr. President," when I see this picture. When Andrea wasn't catching waves on the beach at 3 on her longboard, or going on a hike, or helping a friend with schoolwork or a sorority project, she was doing something else. She loved partying. Sure, she was a typical college girl, but why not? This is the best time, and she liked to go wild and let loose in between working and studying hard. During the summer, she would spend that extra time finding a job. One of those places that she landed a job was as an administrative assistant at a law firm in Brentwood. Another time, she worked at Jamba Juice in the UCLA Student Union. But when she wasn't working, why not live it up with good music, great friends, a little drinking, maybe a lot of drinking? We know how college life can be, but it's one of the best places to do it. You're surrounded by so many people who are willing to go anywhere and do anything with you, like music festivals at the drop of a hat. Andrea definitely didn't miss out on Coachella. I've never been, and I'm sure you've heard of it before, but here she is wearing a cute tie-dye dress at Coachella. Tie-dye was another popular outfit choice for Andrea, along with mismatched socks and anything neon or bright. When Andrea was off at college, her little sister would actually raid her closet. Andrea posted a comment on one of Alexa's Facebook pictures, joking around saying, "Do you ever wear your own clothes anymore?" She hashtagged, "I miss my clothes." It's this picture here. Alexa wrote something back like, "Well, someone has to wear them when you're gone." So I could tell they had a very close relationship. Even when Andrea was away at college, she always made a point to keep in contact with her family. Andrea and her mom talked all the time for hours on end. Andrea would call her not only if she just needed something, but just to check to see how her mom was doing. Leslie would get daily calls from Andrea. She would call her mom from all over. Sometimes it was when she was on campus, from the sculpture garden or the botanical garden, or one of her other favorite spots in California. Her mom got to hear all of the details, how much fun she was having and how much she loved it there. I think you have a feel for Andrea's nature and her helpful spirit. Even when she had studying to do and she had a class the next day that she had to wake up early for, it wouldn't matter. She would still be the first one to stay up late with someone, helping them with their homework. So campus life is what the first year of college is all about. It's the dorm rooms, the tight-knit community. But as you become an upperclassman, things shift. It becomes more about being a little more exclusive, which usually includes moving off campus into senior housing. For example, there are some special apartments close to campus where groups of upper-class students, specifically those in fraternities and sororities, rent out the whole complex. That way, they have their own little world outside of the confines of the school, but still close enough to be involved in all the activities. Many seniors look forward to their last year for this reason, and they plan on where they're going to live a year in advance or more. So, it was 2015. It was senior year, and Andrea had a lot of goals for after she graduated. Of course, she wanted to travel. That was high up on her list. She and Jessica talked about one day getting a place on the beach together, and after that, maybe it would be something like the Peace Corps for Andrea, because that's what her friends imagined she would do. She was fearless. She was always stepping out and challenging herself to do new things. But right now, the most important thing was senior year. For Andrea and her 5 other roommates, her Pi Beta Phi sisters, they decided to move into this apartment complex on Roebling Avenue. It is in high demand. Even today, I saw that there are usually waiting lists. It's a coveted location. It's only 5 minutes away from campus, so you can walk there and back so easily. And it's right in the middle of a bunch of frat houses and sororities off roads, like Strathmore Drive or Gailey Avenue. It's definitely the place to be. This building boasts extra-large 2, 3, and 4-bedroom apartments, hardwood floors, washers and dryers in the unit, and parking included in the rent. Also, if you look closely, this apartment complex would be perfect for sorority parties. Look at the huge balconies out front. They face the road where they have frequent block parties. This would also be great for sunbathing, studying, or just enjoying the weather. Andrea shared her apartment with some of her sorority sisters, including close friends Jessica Wessling, who I've mentioned before, Abigail Strauss, Erica Friesen, Samantha Santap-Pau, and Lizzie Matassa. There were other girls from their sorority living in the other units in the same complex, like Sarah Muir, who lived just upstairs. This was a prime location with a beautiful, big courtyard, which was perfect for socializing, especially since all the doors to their apartments were on the inside. So it was easy to see what everyone was doing, to come over to catch up, and that's exactly what I meant by them not locking their doors. There usually wasn't a reason to. Everyone was welcome in each other's apartments, and they knew everyone. Students were also residing in all the surrounding apartment buildings. It was like one big Bruins family. The Bruins is their UCLA mascot, which is like a big grizzly bear. And I almost forgot something. There was another girl living with Andrea and her sisters. Her name was Shea Panda. She's a dog, not a human, but she was the newest addition to Andrea's life. Andrea loved animals. She had a family dog named Chwell back at home in Austin. But now it was time that she had a companion of her own. Shea was a little long-haired Chihuahua Terrier mix. Andrea rescued her from a shelter in January of that year, and Shea Panda gave Andrea a new purpose. She had something to take care of that was her own. And you know how much Andrea loves to give. So her cheeky and goofy side came out when she was introducing her new pet to her sorority sisters. She did it via social media. She made an Instagram called Shea Panda Pup. Shea was the newest member of Pi Beta Phi, introduced as the Pi Beta Phi. Shea's Instagram was pretty funny. It definitely showed off Andrea's sense of humor. She had pictures of her covered in dollar bills, even some provocative poses. I really like the cute ones, like this Valentine's Day picture with a big teddy bear and a box of chocolates. Shea Panda brought so much joy to Andrea's life and to everyone around her. The girls treated her like one of the new sisters to move into their apartment. She had free reign over the whole unit, and Andrea, as social as she was and close with all the girls she lived with, never even shut her bedroom door. It was always open, welcoming her friends in for a chat, to hang out, or to get assistance from her on a project they were working on. She also brought Shea everywhere with her. She kind of reminds me of Elle Woods, with little Bruiser from Legally Blonde. Very fitting for Andrea, with the blonde hair, the bright clothing, and the small dog. I saw that on August 1st of that year. Poor little Shea Panda actually went missing. Andrea was devastated. She posted on Facebook saying, "Shea Panda is on the loose. Please, we need your help to bring this baby home." Thankfully, a few days later, on August 5th, Shea had been found, and Andrea posted an update along with this cute picture of her enjoying some Jamba juice with Shea in her arms. The post read, "Glad tidings, my puppy-loving friends. My tiny pup Shea Panda, who went missing August 1st, has been found. She's a little tired and really hungry, but she's back in my loving arms." By mid-September, Andrea was actually in the process of starting to volunteer at a local animal adoption center. But the only thing on her mind at that very moment was rush week. Senior year meant it was Andrea and her sorority sisters' turn once again to invite the freshmen to explore Pi Beta Phi and all it has to offer. Once the fall came around, it was time for the girls to put everything they needed for rush week together. The first day of the fall semester was Monday, September 21st, and a lot had to get done by the time classes started on the 21st. I had to mention Andrea's post on September 19th. It's one of my favorite music videos. It's Lil Dicky's "Save That Money." I could tell she definitely had a sense of humor when she posted that. Her post also said, "When you're too poor but you still want to hang with your rich homies." It's a classic song and video. If you know, you know. But this would be Andrea's last public Facebook post. She never could have anticipated what was going to happen just one day later. It was Sunday, September 20th, the last weekend before school starts on Thursday, September 24th. The girls decided to hang out on the balconies out in front of their building, drinking, partying, and people watching, as other fraternities and sororities on Roebling Avenue also took part in their own festivities, a big block party. They spent the later part of that afternoon and early evening doing this. And then later, Andrea and her roommates were working on their sorority's recruitment project in their living room. They were making posters, putting together things they would need for setting up their booth in the quad, all the decorations, and more. Andrea was wearing her red Snuggie blanket. She was drinking wine, hanging out, and working on the project. There was a lot to get done, but this was not a school project. It was fun. That was part of what the sorority was all about. That's what's so great about it. It's the social aspect. The girls worked on this project into the early morning hours, and then each one of them started to head to their rooms to get into bed. Jessica and Andrea worked until about 3 a.m., and then they both started to fall asleep on the couch in the living room. Eventually, Jessica got up around 3:30 in the morning and went to sleep in her own room. She's a light sleeper. There were parties all around all the time, so she would have 2 fans going at night to block out the noise from the street. So she fell asleep. The next thing she knew, she was being woken up by someone banging on her bedroom door. Then she heard one of her roommates yelling that their apartment was on fire. So she quickly jumped out of bed and ran out of her bedroom. Once she was out of her door, she saw the fire. Jessica saw her other roommate, Samantha, running toward Andrea's door, which was closed. This seemed odd because she always kept it open to let Shea run free around the apartment. As Samantha opened Andrea's door, Jessica stood right behind her, and they were both screaming, "Andrea," over and over again. They didn't want to believe that she was inside that room, but as their eyes scanned the entire room that was engulfed in flames at this point, they thought they could make out an outline of their sorority sister lying in her bed, surrounded by that fire. It was a lot to take in. It's not something that you can ever prepare yourself for. They didn't know what to do. They couldn't go inside. The fire was growing, and they needed to get out. They only had seconds to decide what to do, so they ran and evacuated the building. Everyone was standing on the sidewalk. It was 7:10 in the morning, and the fire trucks were already on the scene. Los Angeles City Fire Department Captain Alfred Hernandez and other firefighters had arrived to put out the fire. They worked quickly while students gathered around in shock. The firefighters weaved their fire hose up the steps and into the courtyard and into Andrea's room through a set of French doors on her balcony. Smoke could be seen from all over the neighborhood and beyond. Everyone was on high alert, wondering what was going on. Panic hadn't really set in yet, but of course, texts were going out. They were alerting other sorority sisters and students about the location of the fire, that it was at the senior apartments off Roebling Avenue. One of Andrea's close friends, Jackie, who was a Pi Beta Phi sister as well and the chapter president, heard about the fire that morning. She lived in a different apartment complex and was up early, like everyone else, getting ready for rush week. She was in the bathroom dyeing her hair when she heard the news. One of the girls from across the hall said, "I just heard that there's a fire at the senior apartments." Jackie tried to remain calm, but that's where a number of her friends lived. Her first thought was, of course, you know what? Someone probably left their straightener on. I'm sure they're just going to put it out with a towel. Everything's going to be fine. But that is not what was happening. The scene outside on Roebling Avenue was chaotic. You can tell by these photos, everyone was scared. They were confused, and most of all, they were worried about Andrea because her roommates had gathered around and couldn't help but notice that someone was missing. Andrea was unaccounted for. And it was horrifying for Jessica and Samantha because they knew what they saw. Andrea was inside her bedroom, but they didn't want to believe it. Maybe the firefighters were going to be able to rescue her. They couldn't see what was happening, but the fire was fully consuming Andrea's bedroom, and firefighters could not determine if anyone was inside. The flames were so overpowering, it was bad. It took 32 firefighters to put out this fire, which lasted about 15 minutes, but the fire had been burning much longer than that. And I'm sure you know how rapidly it can cause death and destruction. Now, many students and sorority sisters were getting text messages about Andrea, frantic text messages about her being missing, her not being accounted for, but no authorities were telling them anything yet. However, there were officers and firefighters on the scene trying to gather as much information about this fire. How did it start? Did anyone see or hear anything? They were asking so many questions to other residents in that same building, or anyone that had information. It's common for these things to happen in a college town. A lot of people are on their own for the very first time, and yes, they can leave something on like a stove or another appliance, but it seemed as though this fire started from Andrea's bedroom. So how and why? And why wasn't she moving when her friends were screaming her name? Where was she? Well, after the firefighters were able to extinguish the flames, they began looking around the room. That's when they discovered the lifeless and charred body of a woman lying on the bed near the headboard. Sadly, her body had been fully incinerated. There was nothing they could do to help her. She was no longer capable of being resuscitated. The woman was officially pronounced dead at 8 a.m. Now, I am never trying to be graphic for the sake of hurting anyone or being insensitive, disrespectful, or even for shock factor. I think it's very important to give you the facts, and many times they are horrific. Fires are unforgiving. They destroy everything in their path. When firefighters finally realized someone had still been inside while the fire was raging, they wanted to attempt to identify who she was. Unfortunately, she was categorized as a Jane Doe at the time due to the damage to her face. It was so badly burned that it was unrecognizable, and her fingertips were too badly burned to take fingerprints. I saw these pictures, they're haunting. It's incredible how unrecognizable everything is. Everything is just diminished to ash. While firefighters were calling in the coroner to transport their Jane Doe to the morgue, they heard something. They looked toward the noise and noticed something moving. They took a closer look and realized, oh my God, it's a dog, and it's still alive. Poor Shea Panda. It was her at the foot of Andrea's bed, burned, charred, and barely breathing, clinging to life. She was severely injured and needed immediate medical intervention, so they rushed her to an emergency vet office. Meanwhile, outside, Andrea's roommates were telling police that they thought their friend was still inside the apartment. It doesn't take long for everyone to figure out that one of them didn't make it out alive. The coroner shows up on the scene. That's never good. Selena Barrow, a coroner investigator, was called to recover and remove the victim's body. A sense of fear and shock spread across the college town when the coroners could be seen removing a body from the premises. These pictures were posted in the newspaper, and news stations were already on the scene capturing videos as all of this was unfolding. This made everything real. Those close to Andrea knew she was the only one that wasn't accounted for. Of course, Samantha and Jessica saw her lying on that bed, engulfed in flames. Again, the texts and the calls were going out. This time, Jackie's roommate told her that someone was found dead at the senior apartments and that everyone was accounted for except for Andy. That's when Jackie didn't know what to do. She felt frozen. She had just seen Andrea the night before, albeit only for a few minutes, when she ran in to grab a prop for the recruitment skit. She sat there thinking, if this is true and Andrea is dead, that would have been the last time that I would ever see her. Nobody knew how this could have happened. Did Andrea fall asleep and leave a candle burning? There were so many thoughts going through their minds, and firefighters were assessing the scene, asking the same questions. But something stood out to them. They had seen hundreds of fires, and there are clues to be seen inside, signs to look for. First, they checked outlets like this one from the scene. Were any of them blown out? Was it electrical? No, it wasn't, but something didn't belong. A trash can was lying on the top of the bed. That was strange. It didn't get there on its own. Someone must have placed it there, and not only that, its contents were all burned down to ash. It looked suspicious, as though maybe this is how the fire started. It didn't look like an accident. The victim wouldn't have slept with a burning trash can beside her. The firefighters relayed this information to police, and dispatch sent out arson investigators. They arrived on the scene 2 hours after the fire was reported. They took pictures of everything. They wanted everything to appear the way it was before they began their investigation. I have some of these photos, and I'm going to warn you, they're really bad. Let's start with this one. Here are investigators putting the doors back on to envision what they looked like before the blaze. You can see the screen is still in one of them, but both of the frames are charred. They were double French doors from outside the balcony. Now let's move to the inside. Here's the vantage point looking outside from in the room. It looks like a very messy room, but something you have to remember is that firefighters use very high-pressure hoses. Anything in the room that's not bolted down or heavy can be displaced by the power of the water. It's coming in at such a high speed, so all this debris wasn't necessarily in these places before the fire started. If you look closely, you can see a metal shelving unit here. This could have had boxes on it with clothing inside. It could have been very organized. You can still see some folded items still intact on the shelves right here. But see all this? Well, as the fire burned, it destroyed everything, and it just fell to the ground in ashes. These could have been outfits on hangers, in the section of the metal organizer. It's the section without shelves. So it appears to have maybe had long hanging garments. Maybe these were all of Andy's costumes. They could have been hung here, but now they're just a pile of debris. Same with the comforter that is now lying between the bed frame and the metal shelving unit. Just because it's there doesn't mean it was there before. Firefighters used the hose to put out the flames. The water could have picked it up and ripped it off the bed. Anything light could be thrown around the room. We don't know for sure where these items were, but I can see a dresser here. Then there's a pair of shoes still lying next to one another, a Trader Joe's bag on the floor, pillows and bedding. Now, looking at the bed, you can see how the fire burned the mattress down to the springs. A rug is hanging from the outside balcony. Let's look at the room from a different angle. I examined these pictures for probably a good hour just trying to understand the layout of the room. This right here is the side of that dresser I just showed you earlier, and these appear to be a set of drawers. Here are those metal shelves that we already saw. You can now see boxes of what looks like clothing, and some items are still intact. There's another small dresser here. Maybe this could have been like a side table, or maybe it sat inside the metal organizer. Now it's between the bed and the organizer. Now let me show you the bed. You can see the mattress and the springs coming through it. This area right here was circled. I'd say this could be where little Shea Panda was found. The circle was already on the evidence photos, and the only other item in the circle is a cup. When reading documents, they indicated that Shea was found at the foot of the bed. This area is less burned than the other places, so I assumed that this was most likely where the doggy was found. You can see all this debris on the bed, and now to the headboard area. As you can see, this right here is that metal trash can that was observed on the bed, and inside there are burned items of trash. It seemed to investigators that the fire actually originated on the bed, and this led them to believe that someone started the inferno by dumping the contents of this trash can onto the bed and lighting it on fire. Then, the fire moved upward to the ceiling and down the walls, making its way across the whole room. This fire was no accident. Once it was determined to be arson, which is intentional, the investigation was more intense. There was something else amiss. All the blood. There was a lot of it, especially right next to the bed on the floor, and even dripping off of the bed frame. It didn't add up. The blood on the hardwoods was smeared, and there was a great deal of it at this point in particular right next to the bed. Now, I know that they stated that Andrea was near the headboard, but at some point she was hanging off this bed. I know because of a picture I saw from the scene. Towards the headboard, there is a lot of blood on top of that charred bed sheet and trash. There's also blood on the headboard of the bed, which leads me to believe that this is the area of the bed where Samantha and Jessica had witnessed their friend curled up and unresponsive. The way the blood is dripping downward on the side also makes sense if this is where she was laying, bleeding. But why was she bleeding this much? The smeared blood could indicate signs of a struggle. Whatever happened here was done on purpose, and it was beginning to look as though the woman labeled as Jane Doe had been the target of a brutal homicide. While all of this is going on in Los Angeles, Andrea's mom and dad back in Austin, Texas, are getting up and starting their day as usual. Her sister Alexis is at school and she's in math class. Alexis sees her phone ringing, and it's one of Andrea's friends, so she picks up. Never could she have ever expected to hear the words, "Do you know?" Well, she does now, and soon Leslie is made aware of what is being said. She immediately reaches out to the friend that called Alexis, and she said, "What is going on?" She explained to Leslie that there had been a fire in their apartment, and everyone made it out except for Andy. Leslie sat there shocked. She didn't know what to believe. She didn't want to believe this was true. Maybe they just didn't know where she was. Maybe she was at a friend's house, because she couldn't be dead. Andrea's father contacted the LAPD, and they told him that they couldn't release any information until they got to Los Angeles. Of course, the family immediately booked their flights. They prayed that entire trip, just saying, "Please let her be alive." Leslie could not believe this was happening. It was her worst nightmare, and now that premonition made a lot more sense. By 10:30 a.m., Andrea's roommates and other students from the apartment complex were all down at the LAPD being interviewed separately, one after the other. The detectives wanted to put together a time frame of the events that happened before the fire started. There was a lot to gain in these interviews. I'm going to break down all of that information and give you the timeline. All of the girls gave the same account regarding spending time on the balcony out front in their apartment complex, and that was in the early evening, and then working on the recruitment project in the living room, having wine, hanging out together. A roommate you haven't heard much about is Abigail. She got home from work around 10:20 p.m. on Sunday night. The girls were working on the project. She joined in for a little while, and then she made it to bed around 1:30 in the morning. I already told you that Jessica was up the longest with Andrea until she went to bed in her own room around 3:30 a.m. However, there was someone in that apartment that saw Andrea after this. Remember how I mentioned Samantha had a job on campus and that she had to clock in before 6 a.m.? Well, she was allowed to work from home as long as she went in and clocked in, so she left the apartment at approximately 5:50 in the morning. When she was leaving, she actually saw Andrea still asleep on the living room couch. However, when she returned less than an hour later at 6:30 a.m., Andrea was no longer on the couch, and she noticed her bedroom door was closed. In that moment, she recalled thinking, "That's unusual. That wasn't normally how Andrea slept." The biggest lead the police got was when they spoke to Sarah during this time frame that I just laid out. Sarah had been driving her boyfriend to the airport. She came back home around 5:35 a.m. Her apartment is directly above Andrea's room. It was still dark when she arrived. Sarah made her way up the front stairway and into the inner corridor of the adjoining buildings, where her front door was and where the front doors to the apartments are accessed from. From the pictures that I could find, it appears as though the apartments on top have a stairwell that leads to their front doors on the second floor, and the first floor apartments are accessed through doors like these on the bottom floor. So Sarah made her way to her front door in the courtyard, and she was about to turn her key when she heard something that made her turn around. That's when she saw a man at the bottom of the stairwell in the courtyard. As she was turning to face him, he ran away toward the front of the building in the direction of Roebling Avenue. This made her uneasy. She didn't recognize him, and it was in the middle of the night, and it scared her. So she took note of what he was wearing: a black baseball cap, a black and white tank top, and dark-colored jeans. Even with this encounter being as brief as it was, it left Sarah feeling really frightened. So, when she was inside her apartment, she deadbolted the door, and then she texted her boyfriend to let him know what had happened. She told him what she saw, that there had been a man at the bottom of her stairs, and she wasn't sure if she should call the campus police or not. But after speaking on the phone with her boyfriend, she felt a little better. I can understand why. It's tough both ways. On one hand, it could be someone's friend. It could be someone's boyfriend. I mean, it is a college town. New people are coming in and out all the time, so you don't want to jump to conclusions. But on the other hand, sometimes you just have a gut feeling. Maybe it's the way that they're leaving, like running away, that just gives you a bad feeling. There are plenty of walks of shame at this hour of the night when someone's been hooking up with someone, so sometimes you just really can't be sure. But either way, Sarah still felt uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Seeing that stranger in the private part of their complex just didn't sit right with her. She didn't have much longer to sleep, but she did set her alarm, and she tried to get some rest. But just 45 minutes later, around 6:15, she was jolted awake by the sound of a woman screaming and a dog barking loudly. It sounded like it was coming from down below her apartment, and she knew that Andrea had a dog, so she wondered, could it be her? But the thing is, Panda never barked. She had never once heard her, not one time. She hadn't heard anything like this before, so she wasn't sure. The dog was going crazy. There was a shrill bark, then whimpering, and then non-stop barking. So first, Sarah decided to check in with Andrea. She called her phone a couple of times, but she didn't get an answer. But because of what she saw earlier, she decided to call 911. She told the operator that just a couple of minutes ago she heard someone screaming in her complex. The operator was like, "Okay, what's the address?" Sarah told her, "It's 1954 Roebling. Just a couple of minutes ago, I heard someone screaming in my complex." "She's still screaming. Can you hear that?" In the actual 911 call, you can hear a scream. I'm gonna play it again. "She's still screaming." That is chilling. After that, Sarah said she is still screaming, and the operator told her that they're going to send officers to check to see what's going on. I know I keep saying this, but it's a college town. It's not uncommon. Police get calls like this all the time, and it turns out to be some drunk girl just having a good time or something similar. What's really sad is it reminds me so much of the way the cops used to come to the King Road house in Idaho all those times before those 4 students were stabbed to death inside their off-campus house. Some cops have just heard it all. They don't take these calls seriously. Sarah told the operator that she knows the girl below her has a dog. The operator let Sarah know that they're on their way. "Can you hear the sirens?" Sarah's waiting outside on the balcony, freaking out. When she looks down below, she notices that the window pane of Andrea's bedroom was open. She finally let the operator know that yes, she can hear them. They're getting closer now. Then Sarah said, "Okay, they're here." The officers arrived at 6:23 a.m. There were 4 of them, 2 veteran officers, Rodell Suddeth and Alicia Williams, and their 2 rookie cops, Thomas Monteague and Eric Tillett. They were still in training. Sarah was about to speak with police. At this point, she lets them know that she heard screaming and a dog barking, and earlier, she saw a man on the stairwell running away toward the road. But by the time the police had gotten there, the screams and the barking had already stopped. Sarah told them where Andrea's unit was and how to access it if need be, since she thought it sounded like the screams and the barking were coming from there. That is where she directed them to go. The 4 officers made their way to the courtyard, and they began using flashlights to look inside the windows of the 8-unit complex. They were also looking for signs of forced entry in any of the doors, and they didn't see anything out of the ordinary. They flashed their light into the living room of Andrea's apartment and even into her downstairs unit. It had a balcony that led out to the courtyard. They could see her empty bed inside, but they didn't see anything that raised any concerns. The balcony window panes appeared to be closed, the front door was closed, and everything appeared to be normal. So after just 6 minutes, the officers left without even telling Sarah what happened. Having them come out there seemed like a waste to her. It didn't make her feel any better at all. At 6:30 in the morning, the officers made a report that they cleared the scene and there was no evidence of a crime. Sarah was still out on her balcony. She was looking for the police, feeling really confused and nervous. She didn't feel like anything had been resolved. It was like they never got to the bottom of where the screaming was coming from, and Sarah felt uneasy. So she decided to try calling and texting Andrea, but her calls were going directly to voicemail, and she received no response. At this point, it was around 6:45 in the morning. Sarah tried to get in touch with some of the other girls that lived below her, but no one answered their phones. At this point, it was around 6:45, and like I said, she goes out to the balcony again and even calls out to Andrea, just yelling, "Andy," to see if maybe she was down there and would respond. But she got no response. She went back inside and saw her roommate, Erica, was up and in the kitchen getting a glass of water. She tells her everything about the man, the screams, calling 911, how the police came out but never told her what happened, and she just felt bad about everything. Erica tried to make Sarah feel better. She told her, "You know what? Don't worry, the officers probably came and did their job, and everything's probably totally fine." Except it wasn't. Just a few minutes later, as Erica was walking back into her room, Sarah was startled by a loud bang that was coming from right below the unit, and it sounded like Andrea's French doors slamming open. She ran to her bedroom balcony. She looked outside, and the first thing she notices is all the smoke. Then she sees a guy coming out of Andrea's room and jumping over her balcony. She couldn't believe it. It was the same man that she saw earlier, and this time he had a red blanket draped over his shoulders like a cape, and he was running out into the courtyard. Sarah, full of adrenaline, screamed to him, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" She started calling 911 and literally chased after this man. At the same time, Samantha, who was in the unit below, which she shared with Jessica, Andrea, and Abby, was woken up by the fire alarm. She ran out to the living room and heard a female voice from above loudly yelling, "Where are you going?" Or "What are you doing?" She was catching that interaction between Sarah and the man who was escaping from Amanda's room. This was when Samantha realized that there was a fire in their apartment, and she started to wake up the other girls. She banged on Jessica's door, waking her up, and then they both ran to Andrea's room. Samantha was the one who opened Andrea's door, with Jessica looking inside behind her. They saw Andrea lying on the bed as the room was engulfed in flames. Samantha told the police that she noticed blood on Andrea's neck, shoulder, and chest. Both Jessica and Samantha repeatedly called out to Andrea, just screaming, "Andy! Andy!" again and again, but she didn't move. That was when they had to evacuate before the fire got even more intense. Abby recalled being woken up around 6 o'clock to the sound of loud voices and a dog barking. She waited a few minutes, then fell back to sleep. By 7 o'clock, she also heard fire alarms going off, and she ran out of the apartment. As she did, she passed Andrea's room and saw a large fire inside. All of the roommates left the apartment together and called 911 to report the fire. Meanwhile, Sarah had chased this guy, and when he made it to Roebling Avenue, she couldn't see him. But what she did see was a red car pulling out of one of the carports and driving away. She tried to take in every detail of this car so she could relay it to the operator. She made a second 911 call around 7 a.m., frantically explaining that she had just called about a girl screaming and now saw a guy running out of her friend's room and that it was on fire. At this point, the fire alarms in the building were starting to go off, and Andrea's roommates were beginning to wake up. Sarah was still on the phone with 911, and they were asking her the same questions for a second time. She was frustrated, telling them, "I already went through this." But again, she gave the same description, a young man wearing jeans, a tank top, and a baseball cap. Now there was a red blanket wrapped around him, and she believed he got into a red Nissan car. She also relayed a very important piece of information about the car. Since she was part of the authority, she was familiar with Greek letters and knew which letters signified different fraternities. She recalled seeing a sticker on the back of that car in the back window as the car was driving away. She told the police it was Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity that was what the sticker was. By 7:10 a.m., the fire department was there, starting to put out the flames. You are now all caught up. There are so many moving parts and different people involved in what was transpiring, along with different accounts of the night before and the early morning leading up to that fire that took their friend's life. At least they believe Andy is dead, but the coroner has still not made an official statement regarding the victim's identity. All of Andrea's roommates were asked if they knew anyone who would want to hurt Andrea, and they all said no. She had no enemies. Everyone loved Andy. She didn't have a boyfriend, so they really had no idea. The closest they could come was that maybe she had a Tinder date and something went terribly wrong. But even that sounded far-fetched. They had no idea why anyone would want to hurt Andrea on purpose. It just didn't make any sense. They were still all in shock and still hadn't accepted that this was really happening. They just kept replaying that part in their heads when they were desperately trying to think of a way to put out the fire and rescue their friend, only to see her being rolled out by the coroner just a few minutes later. And this whole situation is very traumatic, not only for the girls who lived with Andrea, but for other people in the complex and beyond. It affected everyone in the UCLA community and across Los Angeles as the news spread. Sarah also let detectives know that she saw one of the officers on scene when the fire was being extinguished. She was standing there crying with her friends, and she told them, "I'm the one that called the police." He let her know he was one of the officers that responded to that first 911 call. She asked him point blank, "Did you knock on the door to Andrea's apartment?" He said that they didn't. Sarah was shocked. Another key fact that the roommates added was that Andrea's French doors that led into her bedroom were broken and did not shut entirely. Another thing I gathered that wasn't actually mentioned but was on Reddit was that at every quarter, There's a huge block party on Roebling Avenue near these apartments. Hundreds of students gather out there on the street. People are drinking, starting bonfires in the streets, and basically just partying it up, going wild. 50 to 60 cops usually have to come out there and shut it down. There have been actual fires set on the street. That's almost verbatim from what I read. So it makes sense that at first, some of the students who heard about a fire being somewhere on Roebling Avenue were probably like, oh God, not again. One person on Reddit, who lived in this area for their job at the time, not because they were a student, said that they ended up moving out of this neighborhood and quitting their job because of these parties. They knew several people who did the same, but they were too afraid to complain about it because they were scared that someone would vandalize their places, as a lot of vandalism had gone on, basically in retaliation from students who were angry that someone called the university police during their ragers. This poster on Reddit said that their property was damaged and they had to pay to get it fixed. They personally had to clean up all the garbage that was out on the street in front of their place. So, apparently, this was something that brought a lot of chaos to this area all the time. I did happen to see what looked like a bunch of random trash on the side of the road in this picture when the firefighters first got on the scene. These are important aspects of this case because these parties bring in a bunch of people, many who don't live here or even go to school at UCLA, so they may have to broaden their net to look for suspects. Police also spoke to other people who lived in the complex. A man named Scott Ha, who was a third-year civil engineering student, recalled being woken up by the sounds of fire alarms going off. He said that everyone was screaming and the fire just kept getting bigger and bigger. He heard people screaming Andy's name, but no one could go inside and get her because the fire was getting too big. He also said he saw Andrea the night before and said she was a very outgoing and fun person. After gathering all this information, the police canvassed the neighborhood around Andrea's complex, looking for a red Nissan with the Greek letters and interviewing guys from the local chapter of Lambda Chi Alpha. But no one could recall any of their members having a car that matched that description at all. They didn't have too much to go on, and everyone in this community was on edge. Social media was going crazy. Condolences, shock, and memories were being shared. It was a lot to take in, and there were, of course, also theories about what happened. First, everyone heard there was a fire, and it was shocking enough, but to find out that a fellow student was found dead in a set fire was even more alarming. Yet still, there are unfortunate situations like this that do occur, many situations that make sense, and people were trying to figure out how this could have happened. There are many ways. I mentioned a few: a candle being left burning, maybe a cigarette that was lit, or a joint that fell on the floor, and then the room caught fire. There are just so many assumptions about what had happened, and at this point, no one had officially reported who had died. It wasn't until a couple of days later that the news would get out that this was actually a homicide investigation and not an accidental fire. That changed everything. But for now, I want to jump back to what was going on outside Andrea's apartment. A lot was happening. Curious onlookers, media, and police blocking off this area to preserve evidence and ensure the safety of the community. They had officers on scene around the clock, looking out for anything suspicious. It was around 9 p.m. when two guys, Nicholas and Mahir, approached the officers and told them they wanted to report a crime that had occurred in their apartment, which was right across the street from Andrea's. Of course, this piqued detectives' interest. The guys explained that both of them, along with one other guy, Diego, were UCLA students who lived in a building across the street referred to as Red Roebling at 10943 Roebling Avenue, apartment number 2. While I'd probably call it a shade of orange, here's what it looks like. You can see from the bird's eye view how close their building is in proximity to Andrea's. They explained that they had thrown a party the night before, on Sunday, and that they woke up to find some of their belongings were missing. Mahir's laptop was gone, and he remembered putting his computer in the living room on the futon or the coffee table the night before. Then, Nicholas realized his car keys were missing. He knew he left his car keys on the living room desk. So he checked his car and noticed it was unlocked, and it looked like someone had gone through his glove compartment. They also noticed that a set of Bluetooth Sonos speakers that belonged to Mahir were also missing from their living room. They made a burglary report and provided this information to the homicide detectives. At this point, LA County Deputy District Attorney Victor Avila was appointed to the case. It was believed that the person involved in this burglary most likely had something to do with what happened at Andrea's. At least, they had to investigate to either connect the dots or rule it out as being related. Mahir explained that the Sonos speakers had to be connected to an email address registered online to work, and he provided the current IP address that the speakers were connected to. One of the investigators decided to contact Sonos and let them know what was going on, telling Sonos to please notify them immediately if there was any attempt to register these stolen speakers. Now, I want to tell you what's happening with Andrea's family. They arrived at LAX at midnight, or around 1 a.m. more. Now we're going into day 2, which was September 22nd, and I want to stop here. I said to myself, wow, just think about this for a minute. What if you had been on that plane with them? We're all in our own worlds, especially when we're traveling. We all have our own agendas, our own deadlines, and places to be. I've seen people lose their cool. I know I've been guilty of being impatient. I've traveled enough to witness people being really rude to one another. People being rude to passengers. Think about Andrea's family next time, because you never truly know what someone's going through. It's so sad for me to think that they were flying in to find out about their deceased daughter. Imagine if some stranger had gone off on them because of their own trivial problem that they're having while these people's lives are falling apart. It's just something that I thought about. Finally, they all get to the station, and officers let them know that a crime has occurred and that their loved one was involved. They already know that Andrea is dead, but Leslie doesn't want to accept it. She wants to see her daughter. She wants to hold her for one last time, and she wouldn't believe she was dead unless she saw it for herself. However, at this point, the victim was still unidentified, and the police explained that this is a homicide investigation, so they're not allowed to have access to the body until the autopsy has been completed. Can you even imagine? I bet they said it matter-of-factly. First it's a fire, then it's your daughter who didn't make it out alive, and now she's been murdered. Leslie and her husband were not aware that Andrea had been murdered. They just thought she was unable to escape the fire. However, one of Andrea's roommates actually told them that they saw Andrea curled up on the bed when they were trying to evacuate the building, and they told them how they tried to call out to her again and again, over and over, but she just was lying there with blood on her shoulders and her neck. Leslie knew at that moment that this was more than a fire. The homicide detectives that were working on Andrea's case persuaded Leslie not to insist on seeing Andrea's body at the morgue. It would be a mistake because, according to them, it would be an image that you can never erase from your mind. Seeing her deceased is bad enough, but before they have a chance to clean her body, it would be a lot to take in. At this point, the police asked for dental records in order to confirm Andrea's identity. They were going to be working on the autopsy the very next day, so those records were eventually provided. Andrea's loved ones headed to their hotel so they could wait on updates. And on their way there, one of Andrea's friends texted them and said, "Andrea's dog is alive, but she's in critical condition at the local emergency animal hospital." They got the address and rushed over to be by Shea's side. Leslie and Alexis walked in, and they've got Shea in one of these glass cabinets. I know exactly what they look like. It delivers oxygen to the enclosure so that the animal can receive it without anything being put in their nose or on their body. Shea's in really bad shape. The doctor comes over, introduces themselves, and explains Shea's condition. It's not good news. Shea is in pain and she's suffering, and it doesn't look like she's going to make it. It's terrible news. They had to make a decision. Either let her die on her own, which would be very painful, or let her go be with Andrea sooner by putting her to sleep. That was a very hard decision, but they knew what they needed to do. It wouldn't be fair to make little Shea suffer any longer. They knew she should go and be with her mama. So they took Shea out of that crate, put her in Alexis's arms, and the doctor gave her the injection to peacefully let her slip away. They all said their last goodbyes and told little Shea to kiss Andrea for them. I had to listen to the way Leslie described it in an interview. That poor dog, and what she had to witness. Who would do something like this? The dog had to witness someone evil doing this to Andrea. Shea was there until the very end, trying to protect her owner, staying by her side, and barking until she couldn't hold on any longer. This was also the moment when Leslie realized something terrifying. As she was sitting there, looking at Shea's condition and how badly she was burned and charred, that's when reality hit her. If her daughter was in the same fire and didn't make it out, then this is what her body must have looked like, or worse. It was a sad realization, one that no mother should ever have to imagine. When they met with the district attorney, he promised the family that he would find the person who did this to Andrea and keep them off the streets so that they could never hurt another person again. They were about to get their first lead, but first, let me tell you what they discovered when the autopsy was conducted on September 22nd, the day after Andrea had been found. It's going to be a lot to hear. Dr. Matthew Miller, a deputy medical examiner, performed the autopsy on Andrea's body. He was able to positively identify her from her dental records, but when she was first brought into the medical examiner's office, she was wearing a sports bra and had nothing else on. No pants, no underwear, nothing. That was definitely something they made a note of. Her face and her head were extremely burned and charred. Most of her hair was burned off, but they did notice blood in the hair that was still remaining on the back of her head. Her face was burned beyond the ability to be recognized. Most of her body, about 90%, had been burned. The only skin that was still intact was some on the front and back of her neck, a portion of her chest, as well as her lower back and part of her abdomen. There was also some skin remaining on her left arm, on the backside, and on the front of her left shoulder, but her legs were entirely charred. I also saw the autopsy photos, and by the time she was cleaned up, her skin had a marbleized look to it. There were several varying colors: purple, red, and beige. It was really sad, and the muscles were all exposed all over where the fire had burned through her delicate flesh. Once Andrea's body was cleaned up, it was very obvious that she had been stabbed by a sharp object. She had multiple stab wounds. Now I'm going to tell you the places they found them. There were 5 of them close together on the right side of her neck, all in different directions. The 6th and 7th were on the other side, close together. Then, moving down, the 8th and 9th were near her breast and underneath her left side on her underarm. The 10th and 11th were in the middle of her chest and on one of her breasts. A 12th was found on her left forearm near the inner elbow, and the 13th and 14th, and yes, I am still not done, were in her stomach near her navel, with the 15th in her pelvic area. The 16th and 17th were on her lower back, and the final 2, numbers 18 and 19, were both close together under her chin. It was very brutal. I saw the wounds on her lower back in photos. The wounds on her lower back were almost round in nature. They weren't the type that I usually see that are typical of what a knife would make. However, the fire and what it did to her body could have changed the shape, because the ones to her neck were about 1/4 of an inch long, and they matched what you can imagine a knife would make. They were also 3 inches deep. These made contact with her thyroid gland and perforated the carotid artery. This would have been a rapidly fatal injury. The medical examiner stated that someone with this injury would have died within minutes because those arteries are the ones that bring oxygen and blood to the brain. Andrea's cause of death was multiple stab wounds. There were 2 separate wounds that could have been fatal individually: the stab wound that was 3 inches deep to her right carotid artery, and a stab wound to the left side of her neck, which perforated the left carotid artery. This seems to be a personal crime. This is a type of murder where you have to be very close to the victim, and the sheer number of wounds goes well beyond what is needed to render someone unable to survive. It's overkill. The autopsy also showed that there were low levels of carbon monoxide in Andrea's blood, and there was no soot in her lungs. This meant that she was most likely deceased or close to death when the fire was started. Her death was not a result of the fire itself. and instead, the investigators believe that the fire was started in order to conceal evidence of her murder. Andrea was also found without clothes on below the waist, so swabs were requested to test for male DNA. Criminalist Jessica Gadway collected those samples from Andrea's body. However, it was significantly charred, so that stopped them from doing a full exam. But swabs were taken from the vagina, her anus, and her mouth. The samples were tested for the presence of sperm and male DNA. There were no positive results for either. However, the vaginal sample for male DNA was inconclusive, not negative, for the presence of male DNA, and this was because of how bad Andrea's body was. It was the condition that made it hard for them to test. The next day was Wednesday, September 23rd. Just a couple of days had passed since Andrea was found murdered in her bedroom. The authorities had not revealed her identity yet, but that didn't stop newspapers from running stories with the victim's name as Andrea Andy DelVesco. That was the last thing that her friends wanted to see. It was in black and white. Initially, the local UCLA newspaper, the Daily Bruin, reported that a student had died in a Westwood fire, and they showcased this picture from outside, with the fire trucks in the middle of the street and the arson investigators on scene. They also posted that the police were interested in speaking with anyone who might have information that would lead to an arrest. This article was later updated to clear up reports that the victim's boyfriend was a person of interest. We know the truth. She didn't have a boyfriend. No one even knew who she was yet, and all of this was coming out. UCLA officials stated that they didn't have a suspect at the time. In other news outlets like the Los Angeles Times, they were reporting Andrea's name by the 23rd, just a day before classes were supposed to begin. They ran this article with the headline, "Body Found in Fire Identified," even though Andrea had not officially been identified yet. It was members of her sorority that spoke out. They told him that it was Andrea who had been killed. Jackie Mados was a chapter president and she was interviewed. She said that Andy had a contagious spirit and she was a fearless giver. She was a friend to every person she met and she was always inclusive and there for everyone. She said, "More than anything, Andy wanted us to be ourselves and most of all, to never give up." The article went on to say that even though the sorority released Andrea's name, the LA County coroner's officials had not reported her identity, but that the death was ruled a homicide. The school chancellor, Gene Block, also made a statement saying that UCLA was a close-knit community, that this was tragic and it affected all of them, and that they were going to provide grief counselors on campus. The article also showed this picture of investigators walking up the stairs to Andrea's building. Everyone in the community was on edge. It felt different being on campus because there was a killer out there. Students were expected to go to class the next day. Sarah couldn't go back to normal like that. She had heard Andrea's screams. She was having a really hard time. It was haunting. She couldn't sleep. She was having nightmares. I can only imagine how terrifying it would be to lose someone that you love. You'd be replaying it over and over again in your head. And Sarah, knowing that she tried to help, that she knew something wasn't right, and her friend ended up dead anyway. Sarah had also been displaced from her apartment, along with all of the other residents. They had all been evacuated and relocated temporarily until they were able to repair the building, and of course, until the investigation was completed. Getting back to normal was going to take a long time. The same day that this article went out, a representative from Sonos reached back out to investigators. They said that someone had tried to register the speakers with a new email address, and they gave investigators the new IP address that was now connected to the stolen set of speakers, as well as the name of the person who registered them, a guy named Joseph, and the address where the speakers were currently connected to was out in Fresno, California, which was over 3 hours away from where the speakers had been taken. So the police wasted no time at all. They took that long drive out there, and around 11:30 a.m., they walked right up to that house, knocked on the door, and asked for Joseph. The guy that answered was like, "I'm Joseph," but he said, "There's two Josephs here. I'm Joseph Marcaria, and there's also a Joseph Garcia," and he looked really nervous. The investigators want to know right now, do you own a set of Sonos speakers? Did you try to register them online? Joseph explains that they're not his. He's borrowing them. Well, they already know that they're not his. But what he meant was that he got them from his roommate, who brought them home over the weekend. He said his roommate, Albert, went out to LA on Friday, September 18th, to stay with a friend and attend the Chris Brown concert that night at the Honda Center in Anaheim. When he returned to Fresno days later, on the morning of Tuesday, September 22nd, he placed a bunch of items in their garage, including the Sonos speakers, some silverware, dishes, towels, and liquor bottles. Joseph says to the police, "When I saw the items, I asked Albert where they came from, and he told me that one of his friends from LA was moving and he let him have the items." Now there's another name thrown into the mix. These items seem to have changed hands a number of times, so investigators don't know what to think. Who stole them? Was it Joseph? Was it the other Joseph? Was it his roommate? Or had someone in LA stolen them and somehow this guy, Albert, got a hold of them? They get Albert's full name from his roommate. It's Alberto Medina. They do a background check on him. They find out he's a 22-year-old Fresno State University student. He's currently studying social work and psychology, and he doesn't have a criminal background. They needed a lot more information, but at least Alberto's roommate told investigators where they could find him. The next day, Thursday, September 24th, Jackie, the Pi Beta Phi chapter president, sent out an email in regard to the recruitment process. Jackie said it would continue in honor of Andrea, saying, "I can understand why some may find it hard to understand this choice. However, preparing for recruitment has allowed us an outlet to remember Andy, to refocus on our sisterhood, and help us begin the healing process." She also asked the community to remember Andrea as her good friend. She said, "Losing a friend is hard, no matter the circumstances. We know Andy would have wanted her Pi Phi sisters to move forward and celebrate the friendship we share." At this point, many condolences were being posted on Andrea's Facebook page, her Instagram, and all over social media. Everyone felt so bad for her and what had happened. However, just one day later, the narrative changed, and just as quickly as people were there to be compassionate for Andrea's loss, they were quick to start judging her, even blaming her for her own murder. Yes, it's true, and that's because news outlets were running with a new story, one that painted Andrea as a blonde sorority party girl drug dealer. Yes, there was one headline I read that said, "Drug-dealing sorority girl found murdered." It was bad, but was it true? Was Andrea a drug dealer? We know we shouldn't believe everything we read, but it was hard not to when these reporters had receipts, not from purchasing drugs from her, of course, but they had receipts in the form of court documents. I found them online, and I read them for myself. But before anyone had a chance to dig into them, it was the headlines that caught their attention. It seems whenever drugs are mentioned as being involved in otherwise heartbreaking and heinous crimes, it gets reduced to, "Oh, another drug deal gone wrong," or worse. I saw some people posting things like, "Good, a drug dealer off the streets." Wow, the LA Times seems to be the outlet that ran the story first. Their article said, "UCLA fire victim faced drug charges." It went on to read, "The student found dead in a burning apartment was to appear in court on Friday." So just 5 days after she was found, the Times said that Andrea had been charged with multiple felony counts of drug possession. They specifically listed the drugs as club or party drugs and said that, according to court records, the list of charges included meth. Well, that's all that anyone needed to hear to label Andrea a drug dealer, drug addict, or drug user. The way the word drug was associated with Andrea didn't matter. The whole thing cast a negative light on this poor girl who was brutally killed. Someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. All of a sudden, these keyboard warriors, who I guess have never made any bad choices in life, just went to town typing away, posting the most heartless things about Andrea and what they thought happened to her. In the midst of her loved ones having to deal with the reality that they would never see Andrea alive again, they had to see all this garbage being said about her. Assumptions made by people that didn't even know Andrea. Because if they had, they would know that wasn't who she was. She wasn't some reckless drug dealer who was killed to keep quiet because she was about to go to court. But that was the story that was being thrown around. The article stated that court documents they obtained showed that Andrea was arrested by UCLA campus police on June 4th. There were no details provided about why the police suspected that she was selling drugs, but when they searched her, they found her in possession of the following. According to the charges against her in the felony complaint filed on July 8 by the Superior Court of the State of California, the Times reported that Andrea was charged with possession with the intent to sell MDMA, LSD, and hallucinogenic mushrooms, as well as meth. They went on to add that all of these are considered party drugs, often used at raves and other all-night dances. The article said that Andrea was out on bail at the time of the murder, and she was awaiting her September court date. That bail was set at $120,000. So here people are assuming that Andrea's parents bailed out their little girl, or that she had the money because she was this huge drug dealer. Andrea had actually been released on her own recognizance. See this right here, the OR, in the dollar amount section. This portion of the complaint says, "I ordered that the defendant be held to answer, therefore, and be admitted to bail in the sum of the OR." This means own recognizance. It's not a dollar amount. Andrea didn't pay. Actually, this judge trusted that Andrea would appear for a court date, so she was allowed to leave without posting bail. I'm quoting the NOLA.com website now when I say that, simply put, OR release is no-cost bail. Defendants released on their own recognizance need only a written promise to appear in court. No bail has to be paid. This means she had to appear in court, or else there would be more conditions placed on her, or even more charges. So I guess technically the LA Times wasn't wrong by saying she was out on bail, but she didn't pay anything. Contrary to people thinking that she's this terrible, dangerous, untrustworthy drug dealer, the judge, at their discretion, and probably because of things they look at, like a person's past criminal record or history, assessed the risk that Andrea posed to the public, and it was low, so she was free to go. But none of that was ever mentioned in this article. So as you can probably imagine, it was hard for Andrea's friends and family to read the headlines. I saw them. They were brutal. They were so judgmental. This is college? Like, really? I almost think it's expected that most students are going to experiment with drugs, whether you think it's okay or not. A person doesn't deserve to die because of it. More and more of these articles were popping up with headlines pegging Andrea as having a secret life, even stating that her parents had chosen to ignore their daughter's double life and praise her for her boundless spirit. That was NBCLA that made that lovely statement. A drug dealer was a stretch according to those close to Andrea, but of course, the rumors were spreading. Again, I have to remind you to be sensitive. I'm definitely not condoning drug dealers. But there are times when people go get party favors for other people in their friend group. We don't know the details. All I found were the court documents that don't humanize Andrea at all. Even her defense attorney handling the drug case, Jeremy Lesson, spoke out, saying that Andrea was a very bright young woman, and he thought that she had a very promising future. He was shocked when he heard that she had been killed. Her friends and family know her best, and they said Andrea was not a drug dealer. I did see her mom defending her, saying it wasn't even a large amount of drugs on her, and that she was just getting them to sell to her close group of friends. Her friend Jackie said it wasn't meth, it was Adderall, and that you pretty much couldn't find one student that wasn't taking it at one point or another while they were at UCLA. I'm glad that they were sticking up for her. However, to be fair, when I checked the complaint, it did list methamphetamine. I wanted to see if meth and Adderall were somehow interchangeable, maybe even in the legal sense. Well, methamphetamine and Adderall are both stimulant drugs, so they're both similar in that aspect. Yes, sure. They both have the potential to be abused because they can both be addictive, but they're not the same drug. However, what I found interesting is what I read on the Delhi Health Group site when comparing the substances on a molecular or chemical level. Methamphetamine and Adderall are very closely related. The differences between these two substances are quite minor. They are both classified under the same controlled substance classification, Schedule 2, and both require a prescription if they're in the form of pills. However, usually the type of meth that drug dealers are selling is not prescriptions that are manufactured in a laboratory. They're made privately, obviously not by professionals, and they look very different from pills. The site does say that Adderall falls under the class of drugs known as amphetamines, and on a chemical level, Adderall and meth are close to identical to the naked eye. Wow, I didn't know any of this, and I think a lot of people don't know how closely related they really are. Methamphetamine, however, has an added chemical component called methyl, which is where it gets its name. Methyl consists of a single carbon atom as well as 3 hydrogen atoms, and that separates it from Adderall. People view meth as a much more dangerous drug than Adderall, but actually both of them can be prescribed to people suffering from things like ADHD. So I questioned whether Andrea really had meth pills on her at the time she was arrested. I'm a fact finder, that's how my brain works. I thought, these cops, being sick of seeing overdoses on campus and wanting to eliminate the problem, could see them listing Adderall pills as meth pills because of exactly what many people were thinking. It looks worse for Andrea. It would make sure that she was charged to the highest extent and would hopefully, in their mind, stop selling drugs on their campus, contributing to the negative effects the drugs bring. Or maybe in the same vein, they could have listed meth on this list even if Andrea wasn't carrying Adderall at all, because she did have MDMA on her, a street name for ecstasy or Molly. No one argued about that, and that is a very common party drug. But you know what else MDMA stands for? It starts with 4 letters, meth. MDMA is methyl-3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine. It has methyl in it, just like methamphetamine. So I kind of think that the cops listed meth on that list of drugs not necessarily because Andrea was in possession of meth, but because technically she was in the form of MDMA. I could be wrong, I don't know. I have no other details. That is just my educated guess here. I saw Andrea liked music, she enjoyed partying and dancing, and she attended Coachella. The rest came in June during the summertime when school was out. Nevertheless, social media was going crazy again. It had now shifted from condolences to people having no sympathy for a drug dealer. I wondered, had these people ever loved someone who had been involved in anything illegal? It doesn't automatically make you a demon, not at all. I'm sure most of us either know someone who's partaken in some type of substance. I mean, alcohol is still a drug too. So I challenge you and the people who are judging so harshly and do judge so harshly to at least try to be sensitive. No one's perfect. All of us make mistakes, and hopefully we learn from them. In Andrea's case, the drug angle wasn't even an angle to investigators at all. They weren't even looking into it. There was nothing connecting this crime to anything related to drugs. They saw Andrea as someone at a low level, just selling the usual party drugs to college kids attending Coachella. They didn't even investigate it any further. Instead, they were doubling down on locating Alberto Medina. He was more dangerous than anything else right now, if he was indeed the murderer. On Saturday, September 26th, they finally tracked him down. They've got helicopters in the sky, and they're basically outside the residence, telling him to come out with his hands up. It was a scene, that's for sure. He's arrested and taken to the Fresno County Sheriff's Office in regard to the stolen speakers and into an interrogation or interview room, however you want to label it. You can see him here. He's sitting with 2 detectives. He's the one on the right with a closely shaved head, black tank top, and a tattoo visible on his right arm. They want to know where he was on the weekend of September 18th. He tells them he went to UCLA and stayed with his friend Eric Marquez. He's one of Alberto's friends from high school. They went to the Chris Brown concert, and once they were done there, they went to a party. They partied pretty much the entire weekend, just woke up, drank, hung out, walked around the UCLA campus and the surrounding community, looking for parties, and just chilled. Then he went home on Monday, and that's it. The detectives are like, "That's it?" He's like, "Yeah, that's it." One of the detectives asks him if he or Eric just happened to, grab some speakers from someone while they were hanging out, drinking, just chilling. Alberto responded by saying, "I know of no." So one of the detectives goes on to say that these speakers were down in LA, but somehow they got to Alberto's house. That's when he says, "Okay, here's the deal. Eric actually drove back with me to Fresno. He brought the speakers. While they're pressing him, they said, "Well, wait a minute. Your roommate Joseph said that he saw you drive up and place things in the garage. That's when things change again." Now Alberto apologizes. He says, I'm sorry, I took them. He says, "I am guilty of that." He tells the detectives that there was a party one night and that some engineering students were, in his words, being dicks. So he decided to take the speakers, take a laptop, a bottle of alcohol. But he was really drunk. He says it so casually, he's just like, I was drunk, I took a few things. He put it so lightly, like it wasn't even a big deal. Well, all of this seems to add up to what the residents of that Red Roebling Avenue apartment said they were missing. So the investigators continue listening while Alberto tells them that they left that spot around 5 or 5:30 in the morning. And yes, parties do go on that long. Then he said they went back to Eric's, but that some guy by a dumpster pulled a gun on them and demanded that Alberto give him whatever he had. He had those speakers, but he didn't want to give him the speakers. So he told detectives that this guy ends up trying to shoot him, but they ran and he missed. They asked this guy what he looked like and what he was wearing, and Alberto says, "I think he was wearing jeans and a tank top." Well, the detectives don't know what to think. They know hundreds of people come to that area to party. Just because Alberto was there and stole some things didn't mean that he was also the person who went into Andrea's apartment and killed her. They also know that what Alberto described as what the man with the gun was wearing matches the description of the man Sarah saw running from Andrea's room. He also had a tank top and jeans on, but this is California. That's pretty much the frat boy uniform of the summer. However, what they do know for sure is that Alberto is placing himself right across the street around the same time that Sarah said she saw someone outside their apartment complex, and not too long before the murder. Finally, they begin to question him about whether he was with any girls that night or any night while he was visiting. Alberto says, yeah. He was quick to say, well, yeah, of course, and he gives them two names, Zay Naoa, a UCLA student, and her roommate Gabby. He said he just met the girls that weekend and that they were Eric's friends. They hung out all weekend and partied together. While the detectives were continuing to press him, they're asking, "Are you sure that those were the only girls you were with? That there were no other girls that you remember hanging out with?" After pressing him for a while and telling him, "Come on, you have a conscience. Tell us what happened," Alberto was like, okay, fine. Wow. They feel like they're really gonna get the truth. They finally broke him. He really came off like he really didn't want to tell them this. So he starts over. He said that he and Eric were at that party and it was him that decided to steal the speakers. But he says, well, this a-hole, referring to his friend Eric, goes across the street with a girl he met at the party. Detectives stop him there. They're like, what did the girl look like? Alberto thinks for a second. He says, well, she was a white girl. She was skinny. She had blonde hair. And they said, well, do you know her name? He's thinking for a second and then he says, I want to call her Andy. And he kind of posed it like a question, like he wasn't 100% sure. Wow, detectives must know they're on to something because he literally said the name of their victim. So they asked him if he remembers what she was wearing. Alberto responded by saying, a little shirt, high-top socks, a little bra, and some underwear. That's about it. So she wasn't wearing pants or a skirt? That's when they tell him that something actually happened to that girl, and it's important that he's honest from here on out. In that moment, he has this physical reaction. He just puts his hand on his head and says the F word. He says, and then he just blurts out, it's Eric. It's Eric. They were shocked because now they have yet another name, another person that's being implicated, Eric Marquez. Alberto explains that his friend Eric went over there, and in his words, he tried to have sex, or he's having sex, or whatever he's doing, and he comes back running to me and he's like, I just fed up, we gotta go bro, we gotta leave, I just hit the out of this girl. Alberto was saying that while he's busy across the street taking speakers and a laptop, his friend Eric, his good friend, was over there having sex with a girl that he thinks is named Andy. Then after Alberto had put the speakers in his car, he saw Eric come running out of those apartments across the street. He tells them that he had plastic bags around his hands. He says that's how he knew that Eric did something that wasn't right. Then he said that Eric took the plastic bags off, threw them in a dumpster, and then they left. Now they ask him what Eric was wearing, and Alberto says, jeans and a tank top. So here, Alberto is exposing his friend from high school just like that. But we're talking about murder. They haven't told him that yet, but eventually they make it clear that Andrea wasn't just beaten or hit. She was dead. Well, that's when Alberto was like, I know it was Eric. He said later, he found out 100% that Eric was the one who committed this murder because he confronted him about it. He texted him after he found out that a girl had been killed, and his friend admitted that he killed the blonde girl from the other night. That's also when Eric told Alberto that he had sex with that girl. This is a lot. It's exactly what the detectives had been waiting for. Everything is coming together. So they continue. They ask Alberto if he's ever seen a red blanket, and he says yes. Eric did have a red blanket. It was around his neck when he got in the car, but then at some point, Eric took it off. Then he had Alberto carry it, or he put it around Alberto's neck, or he put it in Alberto's car. When they were getting out of the car at Eric's apartment, he was cold. So Alberto grabbed it and wrapped it around his own neck. Well, they've got it all now. They've got the red blanket, the tank top, the jeans, and a confession by Alberto's best friend from high school that not only did he have sex with Andy that night, but he's responsible for her murder. At this point, it's been 5 days since Andrea was found dead. Alberto has now agreed to drive to Los Angeles with the detectives and show them where Eric lives, where he was staying that weekend, and where they can find his friend. Alberto directs them to this building, 11015 Strathmore Drive in Westwood, right near the UCLA campus. This building is only a 5-minute walk to Andrea's apartment where the speakers were stolen. They run a background check on Eric. He's also 22 years old, and he's a 5th-year pre-med student at UCLA. He doesn't have a criminal background either. Later that same day, they confront Eric Marquez at his apartment. They ask him if he has any information about what happened to Andrea DelVesco, and they ask him what he did that weekend with his friend Alberto, specifically the night of September 20th into the early morning hours of the 21st. Eric says that he and Alberto were partying. They were out there all night on Roebling Avenue, and they came back to his apartment and fell asleep around 3 o'clock in the morning until 8 o'clock. He doesn't know what happened, but he knows that they were not involved with the murder, and that they weren't even out there at the time of the murder. They were asleep. That's all he knows. And he was very heavily intoxicated that night. They had basically been drinking all day and all night, and he has no idea about any of those details or who they were with or what they did. So now the detectives have 2 different stories, and Eric is not forthcoming. It seems like Eric is covering something up by saying he just doesn't remember anything, and they've got to get to the bottom of it. Either one of these men could be lying, but now detectives know there's one thing that doesn't lie: surveillance video. So they gain access to security camera footage from Eric's apartment building, and sure enough, they find Eric and Alberto on the video. They're at the elevators to Eric's building. This is around 2:40 in the morning. Eric is on the left, holding a drink in his hand, wearing dark jeans and a t-shirt. Alberto is the one on the right. He's kind of off frame here. He's wearing a dark-colored baseball cap, a tank top, and jeans. So already we have inconsistent information. Alberto was the one wearing a tank top, jeans, and a ball cap, the same outfit Sarah described the stranger wearing when she was unlocking her door at 5:35 a.m. She said the same person jumped over Andrea's balcony. Detectives are trying to get a timeline of where Eric and Alberto were at certain times. Sure enough, once again, they're spotted around 4:34 a.m. going back downstairs. Again, this time it looks like they're doing shots or jello shots or something. You can see clearly that Alberto's arm has a tattoo on it. He matches the description of the person Sarah saw. But many people wear this type of outfit, so they want to keep playing the video for more evidence. You can see Eric is still wearing a t-shirt and jeans. Now this shot right here, you can really see Alberto's tank top, and it's a Nike tank top. Although we can't see the color because this video is in black and white, we know that the suspect was described as wearing a black and white Nike tank top. The time is also important. Remember, Eric said that they were both asleep in his apartment from 3 to 8 a.m. No, they weren't. They were going downstairs to drink. This is very valuable information, but detectives want more, so they keep playing the video. Finally, the camera footage shows Alberto coming off the elevators to go back into Eric's apartment at 7:11 a.m. And get this, Alberto was seen here wearing a blanket. We can't see the color, but I'm going to tell you that it's a red Snuggie blanket, Andrea's Snuggie, that she was wearing when she fell asleep on her living room couch at 3 a.m. It is now on Alberto's shoulders, just like Sarah said the suspect had it on, draped over like a shawl or a cape. Sarah made that 911 call about the suspect running to the street as she chased after him, following that fire at 7:01 in the morning. They had enough time to make the 2-minute drive back, park, walk up to Eric's place, and the footage showed a red car matching the description of the getaway car parked in the parking garage at 7:03 a.m., with 2 people getting out of the car. Eric is not seen wearing the blanket, but remember, Alberto insisted that Eric was the one wearing jeans and a tank top. Bro, why are you going to tell detectives that your friend was wearing the outfit that you were actually wearing if you weren't the one that committed the crime? He also said that some random guy with a gun was wearing a tank top and jeans. To detectives, they believe they've got their man, Albert Medina. But wait, they want to keep going. They want to see when Alberto actually leaves Eric's at 7:30 in the morning. Alberto was seen coming out of Eric's apartment with a trash bag, no shirt, basketball shorts, and he still has a black baseball cap on. I wonder what's in the trash bag. If I had to guess, it's probably Alberto's bloody clothing. Right? Kind of weird place to put your clothes, because I'm sure he brought a bag to spend the weekend with his best friend. And that friend is again just 2 steps behind him, right by his side. He knows Alberto's carrying a trash bag that he got all washed up in his apartment and that he's changed clothes. So what else does he know? That's what the detectives want to find out. So they once again confront Eric, now with the footage. They play for him, they show him screenshots, and they show him the pictures, the ones of him, and one more time they said what happened. Again, he maintained his original story that he didn't know. He was drinking heavily, and it's all a blur. He says he doesn't remember anything, not even getting on the elevators, nothing. Well, they know that can't be 100% true, because someone was driving that red vehicle. It was either Eric waiting in the driver's seat outside for Alberto to get back, or waiting in the passenger seat for his buddy to return. From what they heard, Alberto say that his friend said, remember he said he came running back to the car saying, "I effed up, we gotta go?" Most likely that's what Alberto said to Eric as Eric drove the getaway car. But they can't prove that Eric knew what Alberto did when he was inside Andrea's apartment. It seems as though both of them had the intent to burglarize the apartment where the student had their laptop and their speaker stolen. And since that was the theme of the night, drinking and stealing, detectives surmise that Eric probably assumed Alberto was just hitting up another house to steal things. This is all very circumstantial. They need more evidence. But they have enough probable cause to get a search warrant for both residences, Eric's and Alberto's. They also arrest both of them, and they're holding them until further investigation can be completed. That day when booking, they book both men in jail, and they have pictures of their bodies taken. It turns out Eric has no scratches on him, none on his face, on his hands, and nothing. He's clean. But it was a different story when they examined Alberto. He has several small nicks and scratches on his face that I'm showing you right here, as well as on his arms. As a matter of fact, there are a number of small cuts on his left hand, as you can see here, as well as a mark on the top of his head. It looks like he was in some kind of fight. It's all more evidence that Alberto was the one who killed Andrea. But when questioned about it, he said he got into a fight with someone. He doesn't remember it. He was drunk. On Sunday, September 27th, detectives are conducting a search of Eric's apartment. Kristen Rocco, an LAPD criminalist, found suspected blood in a number of locations, and they were collected for analysis. Now for Alberto's Fresno home that he shared with his roommates. Remember Joseph and Joseph? First, they locate the red Nissan Sentra, and they have it towed to the crime lab for testing. It's got the 3 letters for Lambda Chi Alpha, and it belongs to Alberto. When they contact the Fresno chapter of the fraternity, they're told that Alberto Medina had been suspended for violating the standards of conduct. When they search Alberto's room, they find a black trash bag in his closet. Remember, he was carrying that trash bag at Eric's? You'd think he would have thrown it away, but thankfully he didn't. When they pick it up, they see a bloody knife underneath it. When they open up that trash bag, the first thing they find is a big red Snuggie blanket, a black and white Nike tank top that has what looks like blood stains on it, and a pair of women's underwear. There was also a gray towel inside, black shorts, 2 pairs of men's underwear, a belt, 1 sock, and a cell phone. There was also a smaller white trash bag found in the closet, and it also had suspected blood on it. All of these items were sent to the crime lab to be tested for DNA, and it is not looking good for Alberto Medina. I would just talk about how dumb criminals really are. What is it? Is it adrenaline? Why not just throw the evidence away? Why keep it? Is it a memento? It's just mind-boggling, but I'm so glad they make mistakes like this. But the biggest mistake was taking someone's life to begin with. At this point, the other Joseph that lived with Alberto came forward, Joseph Garcia. He told investigators that when Alberto returned from Los Angeles, one of the first things he said was how crazy it was that a girl had been murdered right near where he was staying, over near UCLA. When Joseph asked him what happened, Alberto said that it looked like someone broke into her apartment and that the guy took advantage of her, forced her into intercourse. He used the RW, and then they burned the body to get rid of the evidence. Alberto was actually glorifying the burning of the body, and he said that he was positive that the perpetrator would get away with it. He also acted like it was really smart that the guy burned the place, not smart that he told his friend about it. The very next day, Monday, September 28th, Alberto's red Nissan was being examined. They found suspected blood smeared on the exterior door handle of the driver's door, suspected blood on the inside plastic inner handle, and the steering wheel. Another black sock was found that matched the one in the trash can. It also had suspected blood on it and was recovered from the trunk of the car as well. This was more than enough evidence to charge these men for the crime. Both were arrested on September 28th and held without bond for Andrea DelVesco's murder. Prosecutors charged both men with 1 count of murder and 2 counts of burglary. Alberto was also charged with arson, and he was facing the death penalty. A hearing was set for the very next day. Of course, both Alberto and Eric pleaded not guilty to the charges at the hearing. About 20 of Eric's friends and family members showed up to support him, as well as Alberto's family, including his father, Jose. His father told reporters that his son told him he didn't do it. Eric's mother, who did not speak English but had her younger son translate for her, said that Eric came home to visit them on Saturday. That was also the day he was initially questioned by police. They went to see a movie, and Eric acted happy, like nothing was wrong at all. She also let the media know that her son was a hard-working student who wanted to become a doctor. She said he's a perfect son, a perfect person, a perfect boy. She went on to tell reporters that she didn't believe her son was guilty and that he never mentioned anything about a girl or a fire. His younger brother said that his mom can't comprehend or understand why he was picked. He's a good kid, he said. Picked? I don't think he was picked. I know it's hard for parents in these situations. They want to be supportive. I understand that. But it was almost implied that the police were pegging this crime on Eric, that he didn't willingly participate as Alberto's friend. But this was before the trial, so they are still innocent until proven guilty. By the next day, articles were up, including one saying that 2 men were being held in the death of a UCLA student. They were also asking the public for information in regard to the night of the 20th into the 21st. Someone came forward. His name is Julio. He was a cook at UCLA, and at around 5:30 in the morning, on the 21st of September, After the parties on the street were wrapping up, Julio was out there collecting recyclable cans. He was on Roebling Avenue and saw a man get out of the driver's seat of a small red car that was parked across the street from Andrea's apartment building. The man had a large tattoo on his right arm and was acting belligerent. He came up and got in Julio's face and said, "Man, you know how to fight?" Something to that effect. Julio was just standing there like, "What are you talking about? Leave me alone." Julio went on to explain that there was another man seated in the front passenger seat of the red car, and both of them looked drunk. They were just laughing and carrying on together. Then the guy who got out of the car, the one who was asking him if he knew how to fight, explained to Julio that he needed help getting into an apartment where a girl lived in case there was a guy inside there. Julio noted that this guy seemed drugged, he was just heavily intoxicated, and Julio just said no. Then this man walked up toward Andrea's apartment building and went up the front stairs. That's when Julio left to go to work. It was only 5 minutes later when Sarah came home and saw a man in a black baseball cap, a tank top, and jeans at the bottom of the stairwell. This was it. Now everyone had to wait for the trial. Meanwhile, the evidence was being tested, and I want to tell you the results, but I also want to mention some things that were uncovered between the arrests and the trial. First, the evidence. You could have probably guessed. The DNA profile from the bloodstains that were on the knife and the white trash bag from inside the closet both matched Andrea's DNA profile. The major DNA profile from a bloodstain on the collar of the tank top also matched Andrea. There was a partial DNA profile from the sample taken from the woman's underwear that was consistent with Andrea's DNA as well. Plus, the blood on that sock found in the trunk matched Andrea's DNA, and the blood on the car door handle was a partial match. The blood at Eric's was a match to Andrea's. Andrea's family was overwhelmed with grief, but they were glad that Alberto and Eric had been arrested. However, not too long afterward, Arthur and Leslie were made aware that Sarah made those 911 calls, 2 of them, and the fact that 4 police officers were on scene after the screams were heard coming from their daughter's apartment. This changed everything. They started to wonder if their daughter would still be alive if these officers had actually investigated. They didn't even knock on the doors. When Andrea's dad tried to ask the LAPD about the details of that initial call and the response, he said his questions were very poorly received. He said he was rebuffed vigorously, and Leslie added that they made him feel uncomfortable for even asking these questions. But they were shocked by the fact that 4 officers were right there when their daughter was most likely being killed, and they didn't even knock on the door to make sure that nothing was going on. The call was made at 6:18, and the police were there in minutes at 6:23. Leslie will never know if her daughter was still alive when they got there, and that something could have been done to stop her killer. But that's a lot to think about. Even if she was already deceased, Leslie made another good point. If they had gotten there before the fire was started, at the very least, an additional violation wouldn't have been carried out on her body. They would have been able to see her the way she would have looked before she was completely burned. She went on to say she could have held her daughter one last time had those officers prevented the killer from burning the building. If they could have intervened faster, if they had not just left, because they were only there for 6 minutes, and by 7 a.m., the place was on fire. Both Leslie and Arthur were grateful for all the hard work that the LAPD had done to capture the people they believed did this, but they truly felt like a mistake was made here, and they were hoping that an investigation would be carried out. An obituary went out in the Austin American-Statesman newspaper on October 11th, with all the wonderful things that Andrea's family wanted her to be remembered for, as well as information about her celebration of life that was scheduled for October 17th at her alma mater, St. Andrew's Episcopal. Leslie said that Andrea was a beautiful soul. She was one of the most loving, giving people that she knew. She always put the needs of others before hers. She also said she kept getting letters and notes from people from UCLA, and she said some we knew and some we never knew, about how she touched their lives. Leslie said that they knew how wonderful Andrea was, and how lucky they were to have her. But to have all of these people telling them how she impacted their lives in such a positive and loving way really helped them when they were grieving. They were also so thankful that they had 21 years with her, and they just wanted everyone to remember her with love. They hoped that she was at peace and that they would love her forever. Her little sister, Alexis, was quoted saying, "I would like to steal all of her clothes because I just wanted to be her. I feel so lucky to have known her and that she was my sister. That's so cool to me." Her father was still having a hard time speaking about what happened to Andrea, and as the weeks turned into months, they were still waiting. The trial, like many others, just kept getting pushed by the defense so they could examine new evidence. Evidence like phone records, for example, especially Eric's attorneys. One thing I did realize was that a witness placed Alberto in the driver's seat of that getaway car, and that Andrea's blood was found on the driver's side handle of the car as well. So that meant Eric was probably not the getaway driver, but he was waiting outside, and that could make things more complicated for prosecutors. And it did. They wanted to make sure that they were charging him correctly for his participation in the crimes, both the burglary of the UCLA students across the street and his part in Andrea's murder, if he had any part in it at all. That was being reevaluated, and by the fall of 2016, a judge recommended that Eric be tried for aiding and abetting the murder, and Alberto be tried for murder committed during a felony robbery and arson. Prosecutors also charged both men with burglary and Alberto with arson, plus a new charge of cruelty to animals because poor Shea Panda suffered and died as a result of that fire. The death penalty was still on the table in regard to Alberto. By October 2017, Eric's attorneys were looking into a plea deal for their client. They wanted, at the very least, for these two defendants to be tried separately. The prosecutor said that he would consider negotiating a plea for Eric, but it was not on the table for Alberto. Eventually, a deal was made and the two trials were separated. Right after this, around December 2017, Eric actually went ahead and pled guilty to aiding and abetting the burglary to Andrea's, which was first-degree residential burglary and accessory after the fact, so that he would avoid trial altogether. He was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in prison. The prosecutor said that after reviewing the evidence, they believed that this was the appropriate charge to put forth for Eric's part of the crime. Also, an internal investigation was launched into the police officers who responded to that 911 call and left Andrea's without knocking. Andrea's dad was still having a hard time coming to terms with everything that happened. He said, "Countless times I've asked myself what I could have done to prevent this horrific tragedy, and I only hope that the LAPD asked themselves that same question as well." The LAPD spokesperson, Josh Rubenstein, responded to the allegations of misconduct by saying that the LAPD took swift action to hold department personnel accountable for mistakes made in the initial stages of the investigation. He couldn't say too much, but he did say that some of the officers were no longer employed by the LAPD, and he mentioned that the LAPD would work closely with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office to ensure that those responsible for Andrea's murder are held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. Well, it ended up that an internal investigation was done. 2 veteran officers, Sudduth, a 21-year-old veteran, and Williams, who worked there for 7 years, were both found guilty at separate boards of rights hearings. Both of the boards recommended termination. The fact that they were fired never even made headlines, and neither officer chose to speak to the media. However, their attorney, Robert Rico, did, and he said the outcome of the case was undeniably tragic, but the officers were not to blame. One reason that he wanted to point out was that even though Sarah thought the screams were coming from the unit below her, she also mentioned an echo effect in the complex's courtyard that made pinpointing the source of the sound difficult. That was a quote. He also referred to the information that Sarah provided as being vague. This attorney used to be a police officer, so in his expert opinion, with the facts that were known to him, the officers executed proper due diligence in conducting the exterior search, and doing so yielded no evidence of a crime. In the officer's mind, there was no suspect, there was no victim. He said that the officers spoke amongst themselves and discussed knocking on the complex doors, but the most senior officer, STH, made the command decision not to because there just wasn't enough information to start waking up residents that early in the morning. Wow, would it have been that inconvenient? I bet if you asked those residents now, they would much rather have been woken up than have their friend murdered. Attorney Rico went on to say that the officer's failure to knock on the door had no bearing on Andrea's chance of survival. She was dead before the officers got there. Really? Because you were there when she took her last breath, right? That just angered me. Lastly, Rico said that Officer STH and Williams received overly harsh punishments, not because of what they failed to do, but because of the subsequent tragedy they could not have anticipated. He said, "We don't fire people for not knocking on doors." So, the two rookie officers were not fired. Leslie and Arthur's response to all of this was that they were grateful for the aspects of the LAPD's work, but Leslie said that they know they made a mistake and no one from the police department ever apologized for that. Would that have been so hard either, just to say sorry? But I guess it implies guilt. The trial for Alberto Medina began on May 15, 2018, nearly 3 years after Andrea's murder. Her entire family was there. Prosecutor Avila told the court that Alberto was standing trial for 5 separate charges: 1 count of murder, 1 count of arson, 2 counts of burglary, and 1 count of cruelty to animals. In his opening statement, he told the jurors that Andrea's life was taken away from her by Alberto, and that he stabbed her multiple times to silence her so she couldn't call out for help, and that Shea Panda was also silenced and was found by firefighters at the foot of her bed. On the first day of trial, the jury heard from Sarah Muir, the student who made those 911 calls and was an eyewitness. They played those calls for the jury. They also heard from Connor Kirk, who was also a student at the time, and he too saw Alberto's red car with that fraternity sticker fleeing from the scene when the fire was coming out of Andrea's apartment. Mahir, the owner of the Sonos speakers, told the jury about realizing that they were gone, and now he and his roommates had their window in their apartment open because it wouldn't close properly. This could have been how Alberto got inside. His laptop was also retrieved from a shelf in Alberto's closet, and he was able to identify it at trial because of the stickers he knew he put on it. Several other witnesses were called, including the first responders, firefighters, the medical director of VCA West Los Angeles Animal Hospital, in regard to little Shea Panda, and Leslie DelVesco, Andrea's mom. On the second day, they heard from Alberto's roommates, including Joseph Garcia, who told the jury how Alberto told him about the girl that had been murdered and said, "No one would be able to catch the murderer because the individual torched the apartment and left her body unrecognizable." He said that Alberto also told him, "They're probably not even going to be able to ID the body because it was burned so badly." They also heard from Julio Sentian, who was being harassed by Alberto, remember, outside of Andrea's apartment. He was putting his hands in fists and asking him in Spanish if he knew how to fight, because he might need some help getting inside this girl's apartment in case there was a guy inside. He gestured to Andrea's place when he said this. Julio said he left because he was scared of Alberto, and he saw him walk towards Andrea's apartment and sit on those stairs out front. That day of the trial closed out by hearing from Officer Monteague, one of the rookie cops, and he talked about flashing his flashlight into those apartments and not seeing anyone inside or any signs of forced entry. He was also the officer that came back after they were called out to the fire, and he's the one that told Sarah that they had not knocked on the doors. Abigail Stout was one of Andrea's roommates, and she testified that the knife found in Alberto's closet matched a knife set in their apartment. The crime scene technicians testified that the blood matched Andrea's DNA. Alberto declined to testify on his own behalf, which is probably a good idea, and the prosecution rested its case. Then the defense called their only witness. Remember when Alberto said that he was with 2 women that weekend, a girl named Zan and her roommate Gabby? Well, the defense called Marine Corps Second Lieutenant Zay Aoa, a former UCLA Navy ROC cadet and active service member. She was their only defense witness. She said she spent the weekend with Gabby, Alberto, and Eric. She met Alberto through Eric at a friend's birthday party on Friday night. She said that she and her roommate met him again on Sunday to drink in Eric's apartment on Strathmore Drive. She said that they purchased some tequila and cranberry juice at Ralph's earlier that evening, and they spent about 2 hours playing drinking games and that they were pretty drunk, and Alberto was plastered. Then the four of them left the apartment after Eric broke a bong and ran outside. The guys left them to clean up the broken glass, and I found out that this was a screen grab right here from the security footage of Eric and Alberto near the elevators around this time. Then the four of them left for a place called Tommy's Taco on Gailey Avenue, which is right here, a 7-minute walk. But then Alberto called one of Zane's friends a racial slur, so they left. They called an Uber, and all four of them got inside. Zane said that she made it clear to the Uber driver that she wanted the driver to drop off Alberto and Eric first, and then take her and Gabby back home. At this point, she said that Alberto was really drunk and yelling that he wanted to go to her apartment. It was 1:53 when the Uber driver dropped Eric and Alberto off at Eric's, and then the two girls continued to their apartment. Uber receipts were shown to the jury confirming the times and the destinations. When cross-examined, Zane said that she thought Alberto had little consideration for others. She said he was just one of those loud guys. People like that feel like they can do whatever. The fact that right before Andrea was killed, this man was yelling that he wanted to go to Zane's apartment with her is very telling to me. Pent-up sexual aggression mixed with heavy intoxication and possibly drugs. The defense rested. Now something interesting came out during the trial. The prosecution had a theory of how the events took place, that when Julio saw Alberto get out of the car, Eric was in the passenger seat. This was around 5:35 when Sarah saw Alberto on those steps. We can't be sure what transpired after Sarah saw him run away, but somehow he got inside of that apartment. The girls said it was common for them to keep their doors unlocked. Plus, Andrea's French doors were broken and didn't close fully. But there's more. Jessica testified that she and Andrea would go on walks with Shea around the neighborhood. After Alberto was identified, she saw a picture of him and recognized him as someone they encountered that weekend. One of the times that they were walking the dog on Roebling Avenue, possibly that Sunday, she remembers that Andrea had a quick exchange with him, saying that she lived in the Pi Beta Phi sorority apartments. Later they were all up on their front balcony having a party, and he saw those girls. The prosecution believes that between 5:35 and the screams that Sarah heard around 6:15, Alberto had somehow made his way inside. They know that Andrea was initially sleeping on the couch in the living room, but was found in her bedroom behind a closed door. She never closed her door at night. Remember, Samantha left around 5:50 in the morning and saw her roommate Andrea sleeping on that couch. But by 6:30, she was in her room behind a closed door. The fact that Alberto had asked Julio if he could fight definitely points to the fact that he took that knife that Andrea's roommates recognized and visually matched to a knife block in Andrea's kitchen. Most likely, as soon as he came inside. He could have taken it to protect himself in case a guy was in the apartment, like he told Julio, or because he knew all along what he was going to do. Either way, the intention to arm himself was there. He most likely wielded that knife to get Andrea to go to her room. Whether he came through the front doors or the French doors doesn't really make a difference, but we know that the killer exited through the French doors later. It's believed that Alberto forced Andrea to have sex with him while threatening her with a knife. At some point, she began to scream. Whether this was before, during, or after the forced sexual contact, we don't know for sure. But Shea also began barking, and this was heard by Sarah at 6:15, just 45 minutes after Alberto had been seen lurking around the apartments. The murder was most likely taking place. Andrea was being stabbed, and we know 2 of those wounds would have been instantly fatal. The cops got there at 6:23 and used flashlights to look inside the rooms. They didn't see anyone on Andrea's bed, but the blood on the floor tells the story. She was most likely on the floor with Alberto when the police were outside. She was bleeding out. Who knows if little Shea was being silenced by being held or hurt. At that point, no barks were heard, or maybe since she usually doesn't bark, once Andrea stopped fighting and was dying on the floor, little Shea stopped fighting too. No one except the killer knows what happened in the time frame between the 911 calls, but the prosecutor believed that Alberto was inside whether he knew cops were there or not. He went undetected, and then he placed Andrea on her bed, took a trash can, started a fire with what was inside, and dumped it on top of Andrea to cover up the evidence that she had been stabbed. Remember Alberto's description of what Andrea was wearing when he allegedly saw her at a party before his friend took her to her apartment? A little shirt, high-top socks, a little bra, and some underwear, right? Because she was asleep on the couch with her snuggie covering her. She was found without her underwear, which were later found at Alberto's house. It's clear to me what happened. By May 24th, both sides had rested. Thursday, May 24th, the jury rendered a guilty verdict in the Los Angeles County Superior Court. Judge convicted Medina of first-degree murder. He was also convicted of arson, cruelty to animals, and 2 counts of burglary. But now they have to wait for a sentencing hearing to find out his ultimate fate. The hearing was scheduled for September 21st, 2018, 3 years to the day that Andrea was found murdered. That was a very significant date to her friends and family, who all came to share how much Andrea meant to them in their victim impact statements. About a dozen people spoke. Andrea was described as magic and having the ability to empathize and connect with others. Her friend Heather, while crying, said, "Today is my chance to fight back to my kooky friend Andy. Thank you for wearing color as you dance in this world." Many of her friends talked about the trauma they went through. Lizzie said, "I woke up early to the sound of helicopters. In that moment, the world I knew melted away. What if I was next?" She said that till this day, she wakes up fearing for her life. Many spoke about how they had to hide from reporters that were trying to get statements from them nonstop, and it just kept bringing the pain of their friend's death up again. Another friend of Andrea's, Nicole, said that Andrea's murder brought new fears to her life, like the fear of strange men and a discomfort in the world that we live in. Some of her friends admitted they regretted not taking the police inspection of the property more seriously. They heard them and saw them with their flashlights, but they shrugged it off, and now they wish they hadn't. John Mannheimer, who had been friends with Andrea since freshman year, recalled a day when he came to help her assemble a bed frame. Instead of helping her as he promised, he said he laid on the floor of her apartment just ranting about what an awful day he had. He said, "She didn't even complain that I wasn't helping. She just listened to me. Whenever I had a bad day, she could make it all go away. It was like we were in our own bubble where nothing bad could happen." He said that Andy could see uniqueness in every single person. She was the sweetest person, even to complete strangers. He ended with, "I just miss her. She'll always have a special place in my heart." But out of all of the victim impact statements, it was probably Andrea's mother, Leslie, that stood out most. She mentioned the date, September 21st. It's a constant reminder of the day that Alberto decided to make the choice to take her wonderful, amazing daughter's life. They used to talk for hours. She's gonna miss that. She went on to say that at the very least, could Alberto just tell them the truth about what happened and why he did it? She questioned his intention and his motivation, because she believes he went out looking for blood that night, not just to steal from someone. That was clear from the amount of stab wounds, 19. It was extreme. Leslie said that from the day she was born, she knew that Andrea was an angel on earth. Her father said that though her life was cut short, when she was here, she affected so many people in so many positive ways, and he's just starting to understand it. Throughout the trial, Alberto was emotionless. He never showed remorse. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He addressed Alberto saying, "You murdered a beautiful, innocent person. You have seriously wounded an entire community, and you must never walk free again." The judge also added a symbolic number of years, I think it was 12 extra years on Alberto's life sentence, because of how heinous the crime was. But Alberto's defense attorney asked the judge to remove them because she argued that the murder was out of character for Alberto, that he didn't have a criminal record, And he didn't go into Andrea's with a weapon, so it wasn't premeditated. I totally disagree with that, because premeditation can happen in the blink of an eye. He had plenty of time to decide not to kill Andrea. But his defense attorney went on to say that the murder was not sophisticated, it was the opposite of sophisticated. That he left a bunch of evidence behind, even saying that it wasn't a smart move on his part. And I have to agree with that. Nothing about this crime was smart. It was senseless. The judge, of course, refused the defense's request and kept the additional years on his sentence. Andrea's family was relieved that Alberto would remain behind bars where he belonged, but it doesn't bring Andrea back. Some of her friends said that in honor of Andrea, they wanted to get a fur coat and have it framed so they could display it in their apartment. Her sister Alexis went on to be a hairstylist, and she's super adorable. I'm sure Andrea would be so proud of her, especially her bright hair and her unique style. I want to end with a couple of things that Leslie said. One, she spoke up when the Idaho killings occurred, and she said that she believes on-campus housing is safer than students living off-campus in unsupervised apartments. But she understands it's not possible for schools to provide on-campus housing for every student. So instead, they should focus on teaching students how to be safer, and these institutions should spend more time informing students about the risks that exist and how to reduce them and defend themselves. But I think the most important thing that Andrea's mom said was that even though it's nice to leave your doors open for friends to drop by, don't. Because unfortunately, there are people in this world that don't have your best interest in their hearts. I'll end with Jessica's words about Andrea that she spoke at the vigil. She said, "You are not truly dead unless you are forgotten." A fierce wildfire in California uncovers a charred cabin that has been completely destroyed. A family is unaccounted for, and investigators are searching for clues. You'll be amazed at how they eventually crack this case, so keep watching. The unfortunate events in this case take place in the town of Greenwood, California, in September of 2015. Greenwood had a very tight-knit population of only about 1,000 people. It was a quiet, peaceful little unincorporated community about 50 miles northeast of Sacramento in El Dorado County. Greenwood is described as safe and rural. It has a lot of trees and forestry, and a lot of the houses there are used as vacation homes for people from down south or in the San Francisco Bay Area. But what you may or may not know about California forests is that they can be the setting for the type of story that we usually see on I Survived. And that is because there is the looming threat of wildfires, and they can break out without notice. With this in mind, on the morning of Sunday, September 13th, 2015, El Dorado County 911 dispatchers received a call of a possible vegetation fire. Since forest fires can become a community-wide deadly disaster if not addressed rapidly and distinguished as fast as possible, firefighters responded immediately to this scene. Once they were there, what they saw was horrific enough. The flames of this inferno were visibly estimated to be as high as 100 feet tall. Despite how potentially dangerous this fire could be and how far it could spread, it was located in an area that had a creek behind it. So a lot of times when a fire is in an area where there is a body of water, it can help to contain it and even suppress it. And luckily, that is what happened. Firefighters were able to successfully corral this fire, and it consumed 3 acres of land. That is 3 football fields of land, which isn't a little amount of land. But the potential for this fire to be so much more widespread was very high. It only affected and consumed one structure. It was a 600 square foot structure. Here are some photos of what was left. Fires just get out of control so quickly, and they destroy everything in their path, and this building was a total loss. It was burned to the ground. Along with firefighters located on the scene, law enforcement officers were also dispatched to help assist where they could. And they did this as the fire department took the lead on suppressing this fire and to examine what was left of the smoldering structure. Unfortunately, it was way too hot to get close to it to examine exactly what it was, so they had no choice but to process the scene from the furthest point inward. Because of how hot it was, firefighters are putting their lives at risk. So this type of scene is different because you have the potential of the actual officials and the authorities being harmed as well. And that could lead to even more of a catastrophe. So they are advised and actually commanded to stay away. Officers were visually inspecting the completely burned down structure from a safe distance in the beginning stages, trying to figure out who the owner of the property could be and inform them of what transpired. While they were visually inspecting and kind of walking around where they could, that's when one of the investigators started to smell something. They picked up on this scent, and it was this sweet smell, and they couldn't exactly place what it was. But as they continued to inspect what was left of the structure, it finally clicked. The smell was actually flesh. It was burnt flesh. When you work in this type of environment for so long, you have the unfortunate fate of encountering victims whose lives were claimed by these infernos. When both the firefighters and law enforcement officers all reached a consensus that that very specific smell could be none other than of something that was once alive and had been burned by this wildfire, a search began. Now to find possible victims. But at the same time, they can't rule out wild animals either, so it was tough. Since the investigators were restricted in where they could actually search due to the high temperatures, as I mentioned, still emanating from this burned structure. But of course they continued their search where they could do so safely. At the top of the driveway they found a 2-axle trailer as well as an old Dodge work truck. The truck only had one area to sit up front, and I'm going to show you it here. So this could possibly fit about 2 adults comfortably, maximum 3, but that would be a really tight fit. So they're just analyzing, who could have come here? Did they take this truck? How many people potentially were in the cabin, if there were any? They were really trying to figure out whether anyone had been in the cabin when it had been burned down. They ran the plates, and the truck belonged to a company called Buchanan Construction out of Benicia, California, which was about 3 hours from Greenwood. The investigators called Benicia Police Department, and they asked them to find out more information about who owned Buchanan Construction. That's when they made their very first connection, and that was with a 38-year-old man named Adam Buchanan. Police went over to Adam's home, and when they arrived, they took note of a white Ford F-150 truck in the driveway. When they knocked on the door, the only person that was home was a boy. He was a 16-year-old boy named Nolan Buchanan. They asked him, "Are your parents home?" And he told police they were not home, but he had expected them to be home sometime Sunday evening. He wanted to know what was wrong, why the police were there, but the police didn't want to alarm Nolan because they didn't have ample information. Plus, they were not in charge of the case, they were merely gathering information for the Greenwood police and fire departments. When the police asked where his parents were, Nolan explained his dad owned the construction company, and they had recently purchased a second home. It was a cabin out in Greenwood. They would go out there pretty often to complete remodels and renovations on it. And that's where his dad went with his fiancée that weekend, following a birthday party celebration they had for Nolan's half-brother, their 8-year-old son Gavin. They let Nolan stay at home because he wanted to go somewhere with his girlfriend. All of this information was relayed to Greenwood PD as they tried to shield Nolan from any further details of the incident until they could complete a thorough investigation. But of course, like any son, he wanted to know why the police were asking all these questions about his family. They explained that there was a concern in Greenwood, and they would update him as soon as possible. When this information was given to Greenwood Police Department, they now knew who owned the cabin that had been reduced to ash. On Monday, September 14th, 2015, Greenwood officers began to make that 3-hour trip to Benicia to gather even more information. They needed to connect the dots, and they called everyone they could to help find out more information about Adam Buchanan. First, they called his company, where employees gave them both Molly and Adam's cell numbers. Molly is Adam's fiancée. It turned out that neither one of their phones had been active for the last couple of days, and that did not look good. Something had happened, and they just had to figure out what. Where was Adam? What happened to the Buchanan family? They decided to stop by Adam's company, and there were a lot of employees there who could try to fill in the gaps about Adam and his family. After that, they were given the contact information for Adam's mother and father, Howard and Susan Buchanan. When the police told his parents what happened, they were shocked that the cabin had burned to the ground, and obviously, they were very concerned. They knew that their family went there all the time to renovate this cabin, and they knew they were probably there if they weren't to be found at their home. They wanted to know where their son was and whether their family was okay. But again, the police did not want to jump to any conclusions. They were just there to gather information. They needed to know the layout of the cabin. They asked if there were any pictures or floor plans because they wanted to get an understanding of where all the rooms were. The parents gave them as much information as they could about the cabin, and Howard explained it was under construction, that Adam would go up there often, and he was in the process of figuring it all out. And though Adam's parents were concerned about their family, the police had to keep their focus on this fire. They needed to understand how it could have started. They asked whether there were electrical issues that they knew about because of the construction, whether there were generators on the property. They just wanted to get an overall idea of whether this could have happened on accident. They also wanted to know more about Adam Buchanan. He said that growing up, Adam was a happy child. He was vibrant. He was always joking around, smiling, having a good time. He had twin brothers, Andy and Matt, as well as a brother, Eric, and a sister. He loved to work with his hands, and he was always trying to figure things out, put things together, take them apart. So it's no surprise that he gravitated towards construction. He did end up getting married quite young, and the couple had Nolan, who is now 16. But that relationship just didn't work out, and it ended in a divorce. Adam ended up getting custody of Nolan, and they were best buds. Adam did as much as he could for his son. He was a present father. He was always trying to make a better life for them. So as Adam's construction business grew, he was planning to hand it over to Nolan one day. Nolan began learning the ropes when he turned 12 years old. As much as Nolan wanted to take the business seriously, he wasn't as good at picking up things like Adam was. But as he began to follow his dad around, he learned how to run the business from day to day, and it was pretty exciting. He was taking it all on as a future owner, and the business had even been switched recently from Buchanan Construction to Buchanan and Sons Construction Company. Howard explained that his grandson got along great with Adam and that they worked well together. Adam was engaged to a 37-year-old woman named Molly McAfee. Police now had another person to look into. They were able to track down Molly's mother, Susie, and she explained that she actually had Molly pretty young. She had just graduated from high school a week before Molly's birth, and they were very close. It was like they actually grew up together. Molly also had 3 younger brothers, Brett, Brandon, and Matthew, as well as a younger sister, Rachel. Molly was a beautiful baby, and she grew into a beautiful woman. She was very rebellious as a teen, and the one thing she was seeking more than anything was that perfect man that could love her unconditionally. And she finally found him when she met Adam. Molly and Adam met on a dating site 10 years before this, and they talked for a little while before they ended up going to Starbucks. Then they headed over to the gun range because they both had an affinity for hunting. They really clicked, especially because Molly had administrative experience in the construction industry. They were love-struck right away. Their passion was completely undeniable. They were so in love that things were moving very fast, and it wasn't long before Molly was living with Adam and Nolan, who was only 6 years old, in a house that Adam had just bought. It was a brand new house in Venetia, and now they had a little built-in family of their own. But Molly longed to be a mother to her own child. She wanted that experience. She wanted to carry her own baby, and especially because she had had a number of miscarriages over the years, and she was devastated thinking that maybe it wasn't in the cards for her. But to everyone's joint surprise, she did end up getting pregnant with Gavin. Gavin was the light of her life. He was the cutest baby. He had these big blue eyes and blonde hair and this cute little smile and a lovely personality to go with it. Just look at him. He is adorable. He loved playing with his big brother and his cousins and friends, and his grandma Susie said he had quite the imagination, and they knew he would grow up to do amazing things. He was a very old soul. Soon, Adam proposed to Molly, and the Buchanan family was closer than ever. Nolan even called Molly Mom. Molly, Adam, and Nolan even worked together at Buchanan and Sons Construction. At this point, investigators that are back on the scene inform these officers that they found clues that someone had definitely been in the cabin. There were bags of fast food trash by the cabin's adjacent fire pit. Here's a police photo, and it looks to be a Taco Bell bag. Seems like the most likely scenario was that Adam, Molly, and Gavin had gone up to the cabin like Nolan had said. Now they needed to know where they were, and they were about to find out. On day 3 of the search, they could finally get into the structure. It had cooled to a safe temperature, and a portion of it, so they sifted through that portion of the ash. That's when they came across something absolutely terrifying. They found what looked like a human skull. As they were able to get closer and sift through, they knew for sure it was because they stumbled upon a partial chest cavity. Since officers now had confirmation that they had a fatality on their hands, criminal procedures indicated that a death investigation had to be initiated. Because a death investigation had now been initiated, the burned-down structure had become a possible crime scene, and it had to be preserved. They had to do this in hopes that they could reveal the real story of what happened. El Dorado Sheriff's Office detectives were called out to the scene, and they took the lead on this case. Many times in these situations, more often than not, it's a sad scenario where someone could not escape the home in time. Construction was going on here. They did see a propane tank. There's just so many things that could happen, and what they see most is the tragedy where someone is trapped inside. When you got near the rubble, you could still feel the heat coming off of it, and investigators searched where they could, while they avoided the parts that were still superheated. Once again, they stumbled upon more bones. At the time, they didn't know whether these bones belonged to the same individual, but the fact that they were in an entirely different portion of the home made them realize that this is a second set of remains. But they actually couldn't confirm it 100% without walking through the structure because it was still smoldering. Investigators had a growing mystery on their hands, and they had to tally what they currently knew: 20 acres of property, a burned structure, and what they believed to be at least 2 sets of potential human remains, and no explanation of how they died. The El Dorado Sheriff's Office requested crime scene investigators and extra police personnel to the scene, and they began to carefully canvass the 20-acre property. YLA core team investigators and crime scene specialists stayed with the burn structure to process those remains. Photographs were taken of everything as the crime scene personnel carefully looked through the rubble of what could have been the interior of this cabin. They did discover something that made their hearts sink, and that was a 3rd set of human remains. And one piece of this evidence changed the course of this entire case. They were not just dealing with an accidental fire that caused fatalities, because what they were looking at proved that. They were looking at what appeared to be a multiple homicide investigation. So what was this piece of evidence that so significantly redirected their entire investigation from a fire that caused the death of 3 individuals to a full-blown homicide investigation? It was a 5 by 5 centimeter piece of human skull, and right through the center portion of that piece of skull was a perfectly circular hole, which even somebody that was not trained in death investigation or ballistics would know that it was consistent with that of a bullet hole. This was the first real indicator that foul play was present, and that changed everything. But new questions were already forming based on that one piece of skull. Was this a home invasion? Did someone follow this family and take their lives? Whatever the case, the investigators were now potentially dealing with the murder of an entire family. Investigators were moving fast, and they were thoroughly continuing to process this cabin in what appeared to be a giant crime scene. All the evidence was sent to a forensic pathologist for their painstaking work. You know what it's like for them to process all of these bones, put them together in a way that makes sense. It's a really hard job to do, but completely necessary, especially to find justice in these cases. As the story started to unfold, pathologists did find that the first set of human remains had a bullet that was lodged in the hips, and there were fragments of bullets lodged in the spine. The second set of remains had been burned almost to nothing, but they were able to find several shell casings around the remains. And the third set of remains, that person died from a gunshot wound to the head. Some of the things about this picture-perfect family were not so perfect. Police had to interview more of the Buchanan's family members and their friends because they still did not have the identities confirmed, but it made sense that the remains were those of Molly, Adam, and little Gavin. In his very first interview with police, Nolan explained that he did not go to the cabin because 1, there wasn't enough room in the Dodge truck that his parents were taking back to the property, and him and his dog couldn't fit in there. Plus, he had plans to hang out with his girlfriend. Nolan had grown up a lot faster than other boys his age. He was very independent, and his father had no problem trusting him to stay home and watch over the house while they went up to the cabin. He was old enough to drive, and he chose to stay back. They pressed him about how he thought a fire could have occurred. He tried to think of plausible scenarios. He mentioned a theory that his little brother could have caused a fire by tripping over the generator. But then he tells police something significant that piques their interest, and that was about the relationship between Molly and Adam, and that it wasn't a good one. He said that they argued constantly. Now that investigators' interest is piqued, they want to go and find more personal information about the couple, so they track down and interview Molly's mother. Molly's mom explained that sometime in the past 10 years, no one is sure exactly when, things did start to go downhill a bit between Molly and Adam. Friends and relatives that were close to the couple witnessed their frequent arguments. There were times that they wouldn't even speak to one another. Molly would move back and with her mom from time to time. Sometimes she would bring Gavin, and other times Adam was sort of, I don't want to say hold him hostage because it's his son, but he wouldn't allow her to take him. And as a matter of fact, Molly was not welcome at the Buchanan family gatherings anymore. It was just too much for some of the people around them to handle. Molly was described as being unpredictable. There were also accounts that she was using drugs, and on at least 5 separate occasions police were called out to their home because of the arguments between them. By 2015, the couple was fighting on a daily basis. They would call each other names, and they would even throw things at one another. Adam wanted to throw Molly out and to keep Gavin, and I hate when children are in the middle of these adult situations because they are so innocent. They can't choose where their parents are, and for a parent to use that child as a pawn, really, I can imagine what Gavin was going through. Sometimes they would tell Gavin that he would never see his mom again, and other times Molly would walk out and she would claim that she was going to seek custody of Gavin. And this would eventually turn into even worse arguments back and forth. But of course, she would eventually return, and the cycle would continue, and this became a very toxic relationship. They just kept fighting and then going back to one another. Speaking with even more relatives, it started to paint an even more vivid picture of life in the Buchanan household. Nolan got along great with his father, but the tension between him and Molly made him fly off the handle. So there were times that Adam would get irate with Nolan, and he would take that anger out on his son. He would even throw things at him when he was angry. And sometimes these arguments got physical. The one thing that I personally don't like, that was explained by some of the family and friends, was how Nolan would get belittled by his father. A lot of times when they were working together, employees would notice that if Nolan was going a little slower and not as fast, because he wasn't as fast of a learner as Adam used to be, Adam would make him feel like crap. Not everyone learns at the same pace, you're two totally different people. But that just didn't really fly with Adam. He wanted things done the way that he wanted it. However, Nolan was a hard worker, and he wanted to live up to the expectations that his father put on him. And he did become a supervisor of a small crew. Adam's main goal was to teach Nolan everything so that Adam could step back and relax while his son took over everything. And as much as Nolan wanted to make his father proud, he dreamed of something else. He wanted to enlist in the army. It was just one of his goals, but that didn't align with what Adam wanted. Both Molly and Adam would talk with Nolan about their problems with each other. Again, this is super hard, especially for a young child. We don't know when this started. He was only 6 years old when they got together. It's hard on Nolan because he's loyal to his father, and then he starts to begin to find Molly intolerable. He would just try to tolerate her for the simple fact that his dad refused to break things off. Plus, Molly was Gavin's mama, and Nolan loved his little brother. He would babysit him all the time whenever Molly and Adam wanted to go out, and mostly it was when they wanted to go out to drink at the bar. Nolan did his very best to shield his brother from all the arguments that were going on between the parents. There were also accounts from friends and family that Adam was having affairs with other women, and that he was still carrying on one of the relationships. In August of 2015, when they tracked that person down, she explained that Adam would describe Molly as a bizarre woman, but he did say that they were working everything out in the relationship. And maybe that's why they decided to get this cabin in Greenwood, California, as a getaway. And they had recently been putting a lot of work into it. They were renovating the inside and remodeling each and every room, and it was very pretty. Finally, after having suspicions of who the identities of the 3 sets of human remains were, investigators received confirmation from the Department of Justice Crime Lab that the identities of the remains were, in fact, Adam, Molly, and Gavin Buchanan. Where was this unfolding story now taking investigators? They were wondering if this could be the tragic story of someone taking their family's lives and then taking their own, or whether it could involve something with Adam's business and it being a home invasion. Investigators acknowledged that they would not be able to confirm what happened to the Buchanan family until they found a weapon, either in or around the victims where they were located within the structure, or they could confirm with absolute certainty that the weapon was not located at that property at all. And I think you know why, and I'm going to explain it for those that might not be putting it together because, all this can be kind of confusing and fast-paced. Investigators knew that it was really important that they find even the slightest bit of a fragment of a firearm. If a firearm was found, then investigators would point in the direction of a potential murder-suicide. But if there wasn't a firearm, this meant more likely than not there was a suspect that wasn't accounted for. Again, police had the task on their hand that they didn't want to undertake, but they had to because it was part of their jobs. They now had to notify the families of the devastating news that their loved ones were in fact deceased. And that's hard. As investigators, you're there to serve your community, but more importantly the victims, to be their voice and to help put their story together to seek justice. It's difficult when you have to balance the interest that you are a public servant with the interest of loved ones with so many questions, especially when you have no answers. And it's a very emotional situation. When Adam's mother and father were notified, you can imagine it was absolutely devastating. Howard couldn't believe that he just lost 3 members of his family, and the entire family was erased. They were taken away forever without warning, without being able to say goodbye. And he just wanted to know how this happened. Molly's mom had to be notified over the phone, and that's devastating to me because they can't comfort her. She can't look anyone in the eye. There's not that human connection, and she could not believe it. She was in complete shock. She just threw her head back. She was crying hysterically. Even though she knew it was real, she wished it wasn't because it is beyond heartbreaking. You never imagined anything like this is going to happen to you or your child. Molly's mom wanted to be as helpful as possible, even though it was hard to sit there and be level-headed and give police as much information and as truthful as possible when you just found out that you'll never see your daughter. You will never hold your daughter again. You want answers. You want justice. You want closure. So even as sad as she was about Molly, she had to be strong and give them information. She said that she sometimes worried about Molly because she was afraid that either Molly or Adam would end up killing each other. They were both into hunting, so she would always be concerned anytime they would go anywhere, in the mountains or anywhere alone, thinking they have guns. What if they start fighting? Then police had to ask that very personal question about Molly. They wanted to know if she had ever attempted self-harm, and Susie confirmed she had. There were so many ways that this tragedy could have played out. Over the course of the next 5 days, police started to process the entire scene. It was this heaping mass of ash and debris all the way down to the bare floor. They had to go sifting through till they got to the foundation, and no weapon was found. They knew with certainty that Adam, Molly, and Gavin had been killed, and that the person who did it was still out there, with a suspect who could have annihilated an entire family walking the streets. Investigators began to look into the personal lives of Adam and Molly even more, focusing on the possibility that someone they associated with would go to such an extreme measure to commit this heinous crime. But why? Investigators reached back out to Nolan, who by this time was now staying with his grandma and grandpa, and Nolan's account of that weekend was that his family had gone to the cabin, driving the Dodge work truck that we had seen at the scene. It's right here, and that was being used to haul rock up there to put on the outside of the cabin. When investigators asked Nolan about possible issues, whether, was with neighbors or anyone they associated with, Nolan remembered something. There was a neighbor next to the cabin that was growing marijuana, partially on the Buchanan's property, and that was a problem. Investigators knew that there was actually a large marijuana operation, and with these operations came violence in the form of those trying to protect their grow operation with anyone that was attempting to either steal it or alert authorities. These crimes in the area of Greenwood were not unheard of, and over the years, there were several homicides that were associated with marijuana grow operations and locations. When they interviewed Adam's family, the family also confirmed what Nolan said. They said that there was marijuana found on the Buchanan property, and that Adam found out that this was being grown on a segment of his property, and he immediately, without hesitation, went to the neighbor and confronted them. He knocked on the door and he told them, "Look, I'm going to be back next week, and by next weekend, I want all of the marijuana gone off my property, otherwise there's going to be trouble." And he told them, "I'm going to call the police." Nolan at this time was trying to hold everything together. He told the officers he was trying to do his best to be brave, and that he was trying not to break down. And I think that there is definitely a stereotype still about boys that show emotion, that it's weak, but there are moments when crying is appropriate, that letting out your emotions is the healthiest thing that you can do, especially when your parents just died. Even if it's a less traumatic situation, it's okay to cry. Nolan held that in, but he gave police as many facts as possible. Could this marijuana grower who felt threatened possibly have hurt Adam and his family, and then set fire to the cabin? They didn't know. Investigators admitted that this theory was definitely not out of the question. It was actually entirely possible. But investigators still weren't sure if the marijuana grower was the right direction to go in to make that their primary focus. On September 18, 2015, the El Dorado Sheriff's deputies also made contact with the houses close to the cabin property to try to figure out who might know anything about the marijuana farm. One neighbor reported the same exact story about Adam confronting the marijuana farm owner, and that person ran Adam off his property, and that seemed to be the end of it as far as that neighbor knew. Investigators also asked the family and friends of the Buchanans if the Buchanan family's business had any enemies. Apparently, the business was struggling, and Adam just had to lay off a handful of employees. They were now down to their lowest staffing level in the history of their company. They only had 5 employees left. As they started to interview more of these employees that had stuck around, Adam and Molly were described as, friendly enough, but some of them didn't have such nice things to say about them. They just didn't have a very good relationship with them. Molly's sister, Rachel, said from what she understood, Adam was very particular. He was very hard-headed, and he wanted the company to run a certain way, and it wasn't up for debate. If employees were going to be laid off, it's not surprising that one of them could have been disgruntled. The business was also in debt, and investigators confirmed that it was essentially failing. It was at least $30,000 in debt at this point. If you watch True Crime, you probably know that someone's finances and financial trouble is sometimes one of the biggest reasons that these crimes occur, so they had to look into it. Within this financial deep dive, Investigators usually find that the worse a person's personal finances are, or business finances are, the more desperate for a solution these people might become. A search warrant was obtained so that investigators could look deeper into the business and hopefully find out if Adam and Molly had an enemy. There was a lot of work to be done, and investigators got started right away. And in the meanwhile, there was this unrelated, seemingly coastal cleanup going on. It was being done by a local high school, and it was about a mile away from Buchanan and Sons Construction Company. The high school students, I know you've probably been a part of this, they were doing this event where they volunteered to walk up and down, picking up trash and all kinds of other items that had been dumped and discarded along this road. While these students are walking in this area, they find something, a purse that had been discarded in a bush. And get this, guess what they stumble upon right next to the purse? A .22 caliber rifle. The purse and the gun were given to police, and once they were on the scene, they received a surprise that they could never have anticipated. Officers look inside the purse and they find 2 licenses, and guess who they belonged to? They were issued to none other than Adam Buchanan and Molly McAfee. Finding the purse and the rifle was a huge break in this case. Photographs were taken of both of the items and where they were located when they were found, and then they were collected to be analyzed at a later date. Investigators suspected that the person who murdered Adam, Molly, and Gavin at the cabin took the weapon, placed Adam's wallet in Molly's purse, and brought it all back to Benicia, California, and then dumped it with an effort to dispose of the incriminating evidence. But why would they do this a mile away from the family business? Now it's looking like it could be a disgruntled employee, and that was their focus because of where the purse and the gun were found. Investigators thought they had this strong lead that one of the workers that was associated with the business could be that suspect they were looking for, and that's where they headed next. A search warrant was obtained and authorized, and the investigators executed a warrant at the Buchanan family business. They went through the financial records, their computers, they went through all the vehicles, they were all seized, and they examined everything. They wanted to know, did anything happen in the business? Were any of the vehicles used to harm any of these people? What happened? Investigators were able to confirm not only was the business in debt and failing, but they also discovered something that changed everything. There was a video surveillance system, and it recorded the exterior of the building and the parking lot. Investigators knew that the family left on Friday, September 11, 2015 for the cabin. They were hoping they would get lucky and uncover key information from that video. Once they focused on that camera system, they found a specific camera that was pointed straight into the construction area parking lot, right where one of the Buchanan vehicles was parked. They went through the video surveillance recordings for September 11th and found footage of Adam, but not only of Adam and Nolan. They were loading pallets of rock onto the 2-axle trailer. It was found to be unhitched and parked at the cabin. And remember, Nolan explained his dad goes up there, they're doing the exterior, they've got all this rock that they're hauling over there, so you know it's making sense. This was the very same trailer that the investigators were able to pull that registration information off of and connect it to the Buchanan family. So this all makes sense. And in the video footage, the loaded flatbed trailer was then hitched to a vehicle, but it wasn't hitched to the Dodge truck, the one that had been in the driveway of the cabin. It was hitched to the Ford F-150 that was found to be parked in the driveway of the Buchanan family home. It was kind of confusing. Nolan had originally told investigators that the flatbed trailer had been hitched to the Dodge truck. So something wasn't adding up here, because remember, the reason why Nolan said he couldn't go to the cabin was because he couldn't fit into the Dodge truck. The video surveillance footage of September 11th seemed to now be conflicting with what Nolan had originally told them. So now investigators are thinking if that same white Ford F-150 was used to pull the loaded trailer to the cabin as the video surveillance seemed to imply, then someone had to drive that truck back to the home between Friday, September 11th and Sunday, September 13th, or is there missing information? And they're probably thinking Nolan can give them more of what was going on. Did they just load it up there and then drive the F-150 to the house and then drop the F-150 off? and then pick up the Dodge, because that seems plausible as well. The implication was there, but investigators needed to find solid proof that they could back up the theory that the Ford F-150 was driven to the cabin in Greenwood and not the Dodge. Then, randomly enough, doesn't that always happen? Investigators received a call from some extended family members that had taken Nolan to lunch that day. I think you know where this is going, but stay tuned, it gets kinda weird. Molly's sister, Rachel, described Nolan's behavior at lunch as somewhat bizarre. Now, let me just say one thing. In these situations, I don't think anyone is trained to act a certain way when something traumatic happens, and everyone wants answers. Family members do tend to turn on other people because they're looking so hard to figure out what happened, and a lot of times, family members are looked at first. Nolan's the only family member left at this point that's directly connected to all three of the victims. But according to Rachel, they sat down to have lunch, and she asked him why he wasn't at the cabin that weekend. Nolan, in her perspective, responded strangely. Instead of giving her a reason, his statement was, "I'm no longer an heir. I am the owner. My father put Buchanan and Sons Construction in mine and my brother's names, and now they're not here anymore, so I am now an owner." That seems so odd. And Rachel was shocked by this strange answer and said, Nolan was talking about how he wanted to get emancipated because now he was the sole owner of Buchanan and Sons Construction Company. You know, because they're gone. So Rachel went on to tell police that she then looked down at Nolan's hands and she saw him wearing these two huge gold rings. And she said, "Where did you get those rings? Were they your father's?" She was thinking, this is a sad moment. He misses his father, he's taking some memorable items, and he's wearing them. But Nolan just says, "No, I just bought these." And then she just told police, he just kept saying, I'm the sole owner," and how he was going to liquidate all the assets to keep the company afloat. Just so we're all on the same page, Rachel concluded the report of the weird conversation by saying, Nolan is 16 years old. What 16-year-old talks about being emancipated and liquidating assets? What 16-year-old is cold-hearted when his 8-year-old little brother is gone? And she thought he did something. Now at this point in the story, when I was reading everything, I kept thinking, Nolan knows his dad's business. He was concerned about his dad's business. If he cared about his father, even though his father's gone, he knew his father's wishes were that he took over the business, and his dad was always proud of him, even though his dream was to enlist in the army. Maybe in his grieving, this was the way he knew how to honor his father. And the fact that this is Molly's sister, it would lead me to believe, as someone looking from the outside, that Molly's sister would lean more toward not thinking that her sister's fiancé's family is that great, considering all the fighting and knowing that Nolan wasn't really her biggest fan. But with all these red flags raised, they have to look into Nolan. 2 investigators arrived at the grandparents' home, and they interviewed Nolan at length. They did not tell him about anything that was on that camera surveillance. Instead, they wanted to lock him into his previous statements. The first time they talked to Nolan, they didn't really get into many of the details of what he did that weekend. However, in the second interview, he went into a little more detail, and he told investigators he was home alone on Saturday, and then he told them that he was at church with his girlfriend and her family on Sunday. After church, he hung out with some friends, he went to the mall, he took his girlfriend out on a date, and the investigators say, "Well, how did you pay for the dates?" And Nolan told them that Adam had left him with an ATM card so that he could make purchases. This mention of an ATM card and it being located inside the house, they decide to get a search warrant so that they could get the ATM card. And when they go in, the card is exactly where Nolan said it would be. It was on top of a safe, and then it was seized as evidence. In the driveway was that white Ford F-150 truck, and as they looked closer, investigators noticed there was a pretty good amount of brown dirt on the exterior of this truck. The dirt was analyzed, and they found it to be consistent with the soil around the cabin. The investigators seized the truck for evidence. They wanted to gather more evidence that might be present within the interior of the vehicle. Once they received confirmation that Nolan was lying about which truck was taken to the cabin, Nolan immediately became the main suspect of this crime. But before you think this is an open and shut case, there's more. It is really hard for me to comprehend that a 16-year-old could do this to his entire family, including his little brother who he loves and adores. But at this point, it seemed like this is all they had to go on, that the evidence against Nolan was building. Nolan's fingerprints were on that .22 caliber, and again, he is a family member. Could it be that his fingerprints were on it because he's touched it, moved it, been near it? Well, regardless, we've got a match. But investigators still needed to prove the fact that Nolan was at the cabin if they were hoping that this case would hold up in court. Once investigators had that information, it would at the very least eliminate with certainty any other theory about how Adam, Molly, and Gavin were killed. But how were they going to be able to prove that Nolan was, in fact, at the cabin on Friday, September 11th, to Sunday, September 13th? Their efforts were intensely focused now on that bank account and the transactions. Investigators looked at the bank accounts of Adam and Molly and all the transactions in the days before, during, and after that weekend they were at the cabin. The very first transaction on one of the debit accounts was on Friday, September 11th, the day that the family would have gone up to the cabin. And it showed a transaction in Fairfield, California, which is on the way to the cabin, and this was for $36.80 at Taco Bell. And that's a lot to spend at Taco Bell. The investigators went straight to that specific Taco Bell and asked for their video surveillance. And lo and behold, it revealed the Buchanan family was driving the white Ford F-150 in the drive-thru on September 11th at 8:38. So now we definitely have a problem, Nolan. We definitely have a problem. They could also see that the double axle trailer was being pulled by that Ford F-150, the same one that the rocks are being loaded on, the exact same trailer that was left behind at the cabin that they found on September 13th. Since this Ford F-150 seemed to connect significant events in the timeline, investigators decided to fully search and process the truck for any clues that could substantiate the Taco Bell visit and who might have been in the truck. And this is the part of this case that intrigued me the most. And it might seem kind of like a small thing, but to me it was a pretty interesting connection that they made. Investigators combed through that truck, and when they did, they found a Taco Bell receipt that matched both the total that they found charged to the check card and the date that the truck was seen in the Taco Bell drive-thru. But investigators also found something else when they looked at this receipt that already connected the dots of like, yes, the family was there, and this was the night they went, and this was the amount. They found something so much more significant. The receipt showed that 4 drinks were ordered. 4 drinks? And some might think he was with someone. Again, investigators went back through the evidence that was collected on September 13th, and that's when they found that between the empty drink cups left in the Ford F-150 truck and several Taco Bell cups found at the fire pit, they were able to account for all 4 cups and the type of drinks that were on the receipt. It was now confirmed that the Ford F-150 truck had been at the cabin that weekend. As investigators continued to comb through all of the Buchanan's financial life in the days before, during, and after the murders, a transaction was located that occurred on Sunday, September 12th, for $40 at an ATM that was located at a club. It was called the Valencia Club, and as it turned out, it was a bar that was about 30 minutes away from the cabin. Investigators were sent out to the bar, and they were able to locate video surveillance from there as well, and it showed Molly and Adam inside the bar and their Ford F-150 in the parking lot. Why do they have to keep confirming this? It just sets up more and more evidence, and that's what they're trying to do, build a case. So yes, we already know the Ford F-150 was used, and it was in the drive-thru at Taco Bell, but it was also in the parking lot on another day. There was an ATM camera that recorded Adam's transaction, which he withdrew the $40, and this transaction also placed Adam and Molly in the bar a few hours before the fire. When Adam and Molly left the club, video surveillance recorded them driving out of the parking lot. So they are building a timeline. Since investigators knew which route Adam and Molly would take to get back to the cabin, and the estimated time it would take them to get back, investigators drove that exact route. They were looking for any businesses that could have video surveillance that could have picked up the couple as they headed towards their cabin. And they found, with a lot of work and effort, a nearby cafe that had video surveillance that was facing the highway that Adam and Molly took. The Buchanan's Ford F-150 was recorded at 2:30 am on the morning of Sunday, September 13th, headed toward the cabin. And then as the investigators watched, the same video surveillance footage showed the Buchanan's Ford F-150 passing back by that same cafe headed home. This is when investigators believed that Nolan was driving the F-150, and he left the cabin after getting rid of his own family and setting fire to their bodies. Investigators also found that there were several bank transactions that had been made in Benicia, California, on Sunday, September 13th, that could not have been made by Adam and Molly due to the fact that they were deceased. These charges showed that someone went to Starbucks, McDonald's, and a local gas station. And of course, investigators went to all three to pick up any more video surveillance that they could find. Investigators went to the McDonald's, and they were able to pull up a corresponding receipt and video footage associated with that transaction. And there he was, Nolan Buchanan, in full view, driving his father's Ford F-150. But just to cover all their bases, because the tighter this case was, the better chance they were going to get justice for Adam, Molly, and Gavin. Investigators called that Bank of America, the issuer of that very same bank card that Nolan was using, just to make sure that there was only one card issued to that bank account. So there could be no second card with the same account that was used by someone else. And it was confirmed that there was only one card, and that card was being used by Nolan Buchanan. Investigators also now knew that that one bank card had gone up to the cabin and had made it back down to the Buchanan family home. That was the one that was found on the top of the safe, and that ATM card was in Nolan's possession. I want to tell you what happened with everything and Nolan and what he said happened. On October 1st, 2015, investigators interviewed Nolan at his school, and in previous interviews, Nolan had been consistent in saying that the bank card on top of the safe was the one his dad allowed him to use. Investigators, though, were finally able to tell Nolan the truth that they knew for certain, because they pulled that video surveillance and showed Nolan photos and videos of the F-150 in the Taco Bell parking lot on September 11th as it made its way up to the cabin with Nolan, Molly, Adam, and Gavin as passengers. And they asked him, "What do you think this is?" I see as the investigators pointing to the picture, what do you think this is? And Nolan, he's just staring at the picture for 10 seconds. He's just looking at it, maybe trying to come up with an excuse, or maybe he's going to tell them what happened, and maybe he's not guilty. But that's when he responds with, "I don't know what to say," and that's when they put him under arrest. And in November of 2015, charges were formally filed against Nolan for 3 counts of first-degree murder with an enhancement since he used a firearm. Additionally, with as heinous as this crime was, the prosecution filed for Nolan to be transferred from a juvenile court to an adult court, which was granted in 2017. And then this is when Nolan came forward, and he claimed self-defense. And he said that there were issues, and they ranged from emotional to physical altercations at the hands of his own father, and that his father was the real killer of the Buchanan family. Nolan testified that he was in bed asleep. He did go to the cabin, and he was there with his brother. His brother was in a cot right next to him, and he woke up to screaming and gunshots ringing out. He then heard somebody yell "no," and he saw the barrel of a rifle pointed at his brother. He said he saw the gun raise up as his brother was lying in bed, and he was shot 1 time. At that point, the person turned the gun toward Nolan. Nolan said he attempted to wrestle the gun away. He pushed the person back, got the gun, and shot that person twice. And he said the person who shot his brother and then who he shot was his father, Adam Buchanan. Apparently, within the story, Molly was killed first, and she was the person that yelled "no." That was what he had kind of put together. At that point, Nolan said he left the cabin and went to the truck and decided to grab some gasoline and light everything on fire in order to make it seem like it never happened. If this happened to your family, why in the world would you add insult to injury and do that to your family? It just doesn't seem sane. Then he says he got into the F-150 and fled, but the prosecution was able to forensically disprove Nolan's story of self-defense. The forensic pathologist from the Sacramento County Crime Lab, they testified on rebuttal that circular hole in Gavin's skull was consistent with a perpendicular shot, the shot that Nolan said Adam made in self-defense. In the animation that the defense created for trial, it would have been at a 45-degree angle, and the hole would have been beveled and more of an oval in shape, but the shot was a circle. And that shot that Nolan described was inconsistent with reality. The investigation into the murder of Gavin revealed that Nolan likely took Gavin's life while he was alone with him, before Molly and Adam even came back from the bar. Then, Nolan waited until they came home, and he ambushed them, and this was based on where Adam's body was located that they concluded Gavin's life was taken first. As for the chain of events after Nolan did this horrific crime to his family, was that he collected the rifle, the purse, Adam's wallet, and brought them with him. He set the cabin on fire and drove back home. Then he turned his phone back on because he had it off, called his girlfriend, went to breakfast at McDonald's, went to church with her, went to the mall, hung out with his friends, and acted like nothing happened. The jury did not buy Nolan's version of the events or the physical altercations that he said he suffered at his father's hands. They only deliberated for 2 hours, and they found Nolan guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. What really happened was that Nolan planned to do this to his family before they left for their trip to the cabin, and he attempted to establish an alibi, manipulate police officers, friends, and family into believing that he was just shocked and grieving when he heard about his family's death, and then he made plans to take over his family's business. Nolan was sentenced to 150 years to life for the murders of Molly, Gavin, and Adam. As for why Nolan committed this horrific crime, investigators believe that his motivation was greed. Family and friends think that Nolan thought that he could run the business better than anyone else, including his father, and he wanted everyone out of his way. He was going to get emancipated, and he was going to run that company on his own. He watched his father for years and thought he was going to live this life of luxury. Would that make a 16-year-old do this to his entire family? Was he some kind of narcissistic sociopath? Was it just greed? Did he just think he deserved everything that his father had built and he just couldn't wait to get it? If this savage family murder wasn't enough to shock you, I want to leave you with this. Nolan Buchanan, even though he was sentenced to 150 years in prison, will be eligible for parole after serving just 25 years in prison. So essentially, this teen could get out of prison in his 40s, still giving him a lot of life to live, even though he took 3 lives from this world.